Introduction. Adam Grant is the perfect person to have written this book. Adam has always been passionate about the science of human motivation, unraveling mysteries, and discovering the truths surrounding them. He is an optimist, a progressive thinker, and eager to share profound insights and advice with anyone, from inside their homes to their companies or communities, to make this world a better place. He is also a devoted friend and an inspiration who has given me confidence in myself, helping me understand how to effectively advocate for my ideas. Adam is one of the most influential people in my life. I believe that through these wonderful pages, he will also enlighten, inspire, and support you on your own journey. The Unveiler of Mysteries. It's often assumed that only a few people are born with innate creativity, while the majority rarely come up with unique ideas. Some are born to lead, while others are merely followers. Only a few can create real impact, while most cannot. Through this work, Adam shatters all these assumptions and proves that any of us can elevate our creative abilities. Adam reveals how to identify truly unique and actionable ideas. He also shares when to trust our own intuition and when to rely on others. He even shows us how to become better parents by nurturing creativity in children, and better managers by fostering original ideas instead of rigid, rule-based thinking. Through each page, I learned that great innovators don't necessarily need the deepest expertise, but rather the clearest foresight. I realized that success often doesn't come from being ahead of others, but from patiently waiting for the right moment to act. And I was astonished to hear the author say that procrastination can actually be a good thing. Anyone who has ever worked with me knows I absolutely detest last-minute work. For me, anything that can be done should be done immediately. Mark Zuckerberg and many others would surely be pleased if I could alleviate the constant pressure of pushing myself to finish everything early. But Adam thinks differently. He believes that the habit of procrastination can help me and my team achieve better results. Every day, we all encounter things we like and things that need to change. The first brings us joy. The second is the driving force behind our desire to change the world, to make it more ideal than we usually see it. But changing deeply ingrained behaviors and beliefs is not easy. We passively accept the status quo because changing reality seems almost impossible. But then we ask ourselves, can one swallow make a summer? And in our bravest moments we ask, could that person be me? Adam's powerful answer is yes. This book will prove that any of us can come up with the most brilliant ideas to improve our world. The Devoted Friend. I met Adam when his first book, Give and Take Asterisk, was making huge waves in Silicon Valley. I read it and immediately began quoting its content to anyone who would listen. Adam is not only a talented researcher, but also a gifted teacher and storyteller. He can explain complex ideas in a way that is incredibly simple and understandable. Later, my husband invited Adam to speak to his team at the company, and we went to dinner together. Adam in person was exactly like the person in his pages. His knowledge was as rich as an encyclopedia, and his positive energy radiated to everyone. Adam and I talked about how to use his research to shed light on the gender debate, and we began collaborating. From then on, we conducted research and wrote a series of works about women and work. Lean.org benefited greatly from his superior analysis and commitment to gender equality. Once a year, Facebook holds a global meeting for its team. In 2015, I invited Adam to be the keynote speaker. Everyone was incredibly impressed by his intellect and humor. Months later, people were still talking about Adam's profound insights and putting his advice into action. Over time, Adam and I became friends. When tragedy struck and my husband suddenly passed away, Adam acted like a true friend. He walked into my life during my worst time, just as he had tackled every other problem with his unique psychological insight and boundless generosity. When I thought I could never feel better, Adam flew across the country to see me just to explain the things I could do to rebuild my mindset. When I couldn't find a way to deal with a very heartbreaking situation, he helped me find answers I didn't think existed. When I needed a shoulder to cry on, Adam was always there for me. In the deepest sense of the word, a friend is someone who sees your potential more than you see in yourself. It's someone who helps you become the best version of yourself. The magic of this book is that Adam will become such a friend to the reader. He offers a wealth of advice on how to overcome doubt and fear, how to speak up and present ideas, and how to find allies in seemingly impossible places. He provides practical guidance on how to manage anxiety and anger, how to find strength in weakness, how to overcome obstacles, and how to give hope to others. This is one of the most important and captivating books I have ever read, full of astonishing and powerful ideas. This book will not only change how you see the world, but can also change your life. It can even inspire you to change the world itself. Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook and founder of Lean.org. Part 1. The 4 Students. 4 college students aim to revolutionize a small business, drowning in debt with broken eyeglasses. They rack their brains trying to earn money to replace their glasses. One of them had worn broken glasses for 5 years, using a paperclip to hold the frames together. Though an optometrist twice suggested new glasses, he didn't want to pay for expensive new lenses. Luxottica, the giant dominating the eyewear industry, held over 80% of the market share. To create affordable glasses, these students needed to take down that giant. Recently, seeing Zappos, the largest shoe retailer in the United States, change its business model by selling online, the young men wondered if they could apply a similar model to eyeglasses. Every time they pitched this idea to others, they were met with harsh criticism. No one buys glasses online. People need to get their eyes measured and try on glasses. True, Zappos succeeded with online shoe sales, but eyeglasses were different. People insisted, if this were a great idea, plenty of people would have done it before you. None of these students had a background in e-commerce or technology, let alone retail, fashion, or apparel in general. Despite being told their idea was crazy, they turned down attractive job offers to start their company. They would sell glasses that typically retailed for $500 in traditional stores for $95 on their website, plus donate a pair of glasses to customers in developing countries. This business model relied on the e-commerce functionality of their website. Without a website, customers couldn't browse or buy products. After struggling to build the website, they finally launched their official site at 4:00 a.m. in February 2010. The company was named Warby Parker, a combination of names from Jack Kerouac's novels, who inspired them to bravely break free from societal chains and pressures to embark on their adventure. They instilled that spirit into their company culture, and their efforts paid off. Initially, the students expected to sell 1 or 2 pairs of glasses a day, but when GQ magazine called them the Netflix of eyewear, they hit their first-year sales target in less than a month. Sales were so rapid that they had a waiting list of 20,000 customers. It took them 9 months to restock enough inventory. Not long after, when Fast Company magazine released its list of the world's most innovative companies in 2015, Warby Parker was not only on the list, but held the top position. Previous leaders like Google, Nike, and Apple all had over 50,000 employees, while Warby Parker was a new startup with only 500 employees. In 5 years, these 4 student friends had built one of the leading fashion brands on the planet and donated over 1 million pairs of glasses to those in need. Annually, the company achieved $100 million in revenue and was valued at over $1 billion. The reluctant investor. Looking back to 2009, one of the company's founders pitched the online eyewear business idea to me and wanted me to invest in Warby Parker. But I refused. That was one of the worst financial decisions I ever made, and I needed to understand where I went wrong. I want to talk about the word original. As an adjective, original means the source or beginning of something, where it originates, arises, or transforms. As a noun, original refers to something unique, one of a kind, or a person who is attractively and interestingly different from others, someone capable of creating entirely new inventions or initiatives. Years ago, psychologists discovered 2 paths to achievement: conformity and originality. Conformity means following the majority or tradition and maintaining the status quo. Originality means venturing down less traveled paths with fresh ideas that challenge the status quo and make things better. Of course, nothing is entirely original. In a sense, all our ideas are influenced by what we learn from the world around us. We constantly borrow ideas, intentionally or unintentionally. We are also susceptible to unconscious plagiarism, accidentally remembering and making others' ideas our own. Therefore, I want to define originality as the act of introducing and developing ideas that are somewhat unusual in a given domain, but have the potential to be realized. Novelty stems from creativity generating new and useful ideas, but it doesn't stop there. It's also about taking the initiative to make that vision a reality. The Warby Parker founders broke through with their dream of a unique method-selling glasses online and became pioneers by establishing an accessible and affordable online sales channel. This book is about how we can become more original. In fact, there's a surprising clue right in the web browsers you use every day to access the internet. Finding flaws in default designs. Not long ago, economist Michael Hausman led a project to understand why some customer service companies lasted longer than others. With data collected from calls to over 30,000 employees from banks, airlines, and mobile phone companies, he suspected that their hiring histories contained clues about their commitment levels. He thought that those with more job changes would tend to leave earlier, but in reality, this wasn't the case. The intent to leave among employees who had changed 5 jobs in 5 years was no higher than among those who stayed in the same job for 5 years. Searching for other indicators, Hausman noticed that his team had recorded information about the internet browser job applicants used. Suddenly, he had the idea to check if the browser choice was related to the decision to leave a job. He didn't expect to find a correlation, assuming browser preference was entirely a matter of taste. But when he saw the results, he was astonished. Employees who used Firefox or Chrome during the job application process tended to stay in their jobs 15% longer than those using Internet Explorer or Safari. Thinking it was just a coincidence, Hausman conducted a similar analysis on employees who had left their jobs. He obtained a similar pattern of results. Firefox and Chrome users were 19% less likely to be fired than Internet Explorer and Safari users. He then conducted a performance evaluation study. His team collected nearly 3 million data points on sales, customer satisfaction, and average call duration. The results showed that Firefox and Chrome users achieved significantly higher sales and had shorter customer call times, and their customers were more satisfied. Firefox and Chrome users reached high customer satisfaction levels in just 90 days of work, while Internet Explorer and Safari users took up to 120 days. The browsers themselves were not the reason users were chosen, trusted, and succeeded. Rather, it was a signal of their preference for habitual browser use. Why were Firefox and Chrome users more committed and better performers on all their metrics? The obvious answer would be that they were more tech-savvy. So I asked Hausman if he found that. Oh, employees took all sorts of aptitude tests that assessed their ability to use keyboard shortcuts, software, and hardware, including typing speed. The results showed that Firefox and Chrome users were not better at using computers, nor were they faster or more accurate typists. Even after evaluating test scores, the browser effect remained unchanged for them. Computer knowledge and skills did not explain their advantage. What made the difference was how asterisk users chose their browser. If you were using a Microsoft desktop computer, Internet Explorer was installed by default with Windows. If you used an Apple computer, it was Safari. Most customer service companies, 2/3, used the default browser and never questioned if there was better software. To install Firefox or Chrome, you had to have some knowledge and download a different browser. Instead of accepting the default, you explored for a better option. And that small, creative act was a gateway to different results. Customer service companies using default browsers like Internet Explorer and Safari often used pre-made scripts for sales calls and followed standard operating procedures to handle customer complaints. They stuck to fixed rules in their job descriptions. So, when dissatisfied with their jobs, they started taking days off or even quitting. Employees who took the initiative to switch from a default browser to Firefox or Chrome had a very different approach to work. They sought new sales methods and handled customer complaints more proactively when faced with unpleasant situations. They focused on problem solving. Because they actively solved problems, they had little reason to quit. They shaped their work as they wished. They created exceptions rather than being bound by any rules. We live in the age of Internet Explorer. Just as most customer service employees, two-thirds, use this pre-installed browser, many of us accept the defaults in our lives. In a series of striking studies, a team led by political psychologist John Jost surveyed people's reactions to undesirable default conditions. Compared to European Americans, African Americans were less satisfied with their economic circumstances, but perceived economic inequality as more legitimate and fair than European Americans did. Compared to those in the highest income tax brackets, those in the lowest income brackets viewed economic inequality as acceptable. Their agreement level was 17% higher. When asked if they would support laws limiting civil rights and press criticism of the government, if such laws were deemed necessary to solve national problems, more than twice as many low-income individuals were willing to give up free speech compared to high-income individuals. After noticing that disadvantaged groups insisted on supporting the status quo more than advantaged groups, Jost and his colleagues concluded, it is paradoxical that those who suffer the most from an institution are often the least likely to question, challenge, reject, or change it. To explain this peculiar phenomenon, Jost's team developed a theory of system justification. The core idea is that people tend to rationalize the status quo, even when it goes against their own interests. In one study, they tracked Democratic and Republican candidates before the 2000 U.S. presidential election. When George W. Bush won more votes, Republicans rated him as more likable, and strangely, Democrats also agreed as they prepared to explain the outcome. The same thing happened when Al Gore's chances of success increased. Both Republicans and Democrats rated him as more favorable. Regardless of political ideology, when a candidate is on a winning streak, people like them more. When their chances of success decline, people like them less. System justification provides comfort. It's an emotional pain reliever. If something is just the way it is, we don't have to be upset about it. Of course, this kind of acceptance also robs us of the courage to stand up against injustice and the creative will to seek other, potentially more effective, alternatives. The hallmark of originality is refusing the default and discovering better options. I have spent over a decade researching this issue, and it turns out it's not as difficult as I predicted. The starting point is curiosity. Ask yourself why these defaults exist in the first place. Déjà vu happens when we encounter something new but feel like we've seen it before. Vuejadu is the opposite. We face something very familiar but with a fresh perspective that helps us generate new ideas for specific problems. Without a vuejadu moment, Warby Parker would not exist. When the founders sat in computer labs late at night brainstorming the company, they had a combined 60 years of wearing glasses. Glasses were always unreasonably expensive, but they accepted this status quo as natural, never questioning it until their company was born. That thought never entered my mind, co-founder Dave Gilboa said. I always saw them as health-related purchases. Once the doctor sold me glasses, I trusted that the price was reasonable. Until recently, while standing in line outside an Apple store to buy an iPhone, Dave suddenly found himself comparing the two products. Eyeglasses have been a familiar part of human life for almost 1,000 years, and they have changed little since his great-grandparents used them. For the first time, Dave wondered why a pair of glasses cost so much. Why was such a simple product more expensive than a complex, state-of-the-art smartphone? Anyone could ask such a question and find the same answer as the Warby Parker team. Once they questioned the unreasonable price, they began researching the eyewear industry and learned it was dominated by Luxottica, a European company that had raked in over $7 billion the previous year. Dave said, "We learned that Luxottica owns LensCrafters and Pearle Vision, Ray-Ban, and Oakley. They license sunglasses and prescription glasses for Chanel and Prada. Suddenly, it all made sense why those glasses were so expensive. The production cost couldn't drive the price up that high. Leveraging its monopoly, Luxottica priced products at 20 times their production cost. That default wasn't legitimate. It was a choice made by a group of people within the company, and this meant another group could make alternative choices. Dave suddenly understood the problem. We can make a difference. If we can control our own destiny, we can control our own prices. When we are curious about the boring defaults in this world, we begin to realize that most of them share the same social origin. human-made rules and systems. That realization gives us the courage to find ways to change them. Before women won the right to vote in the US, many of them had never considered this inequality, simply viewing it as natural. As historian Jean Baker noted, as women's suffrage grew stronger, an increasing number of women began to realize that customs, religious rules, and laws were actually human-made, and could therefore be reversed or changed. Two sides of ambition. The pressure to accept defaults often appears earlier than we think. If we consider individuals who leave their mark on the universe as adults, the first group to mention would be child prodigies. These geniuses could read by age 2, play Bach by 4, do math by 6, and speak 7 languages fluently by 8. Their classmates were envious, but their parents rejoiced as if they had won the lottery. However, according to literary critic T.S. Eliot, they often tend to end their careers in sorrow, not glory. Child geniuses, it turns out, are not born to change the world. When psychologists studied the most outstanding and influential people in history, they discovered that many of them were not child prodigies. And if you gather a large group of child prodigies and follow their lives, you'll find they don't shine brighter than their average peers. Intuitively, this makes sense to us. We assume child geniuses are well-versed in academic knowledge but lack practical skills. While they possess superior intelligence, they lack social, emotional, and practical life skills. However, looking at the evidence, this explanation seems unfounded, as less than 25% of child prodigies suffer from emotional and social problems. The majority of them are socially well-adjusted. For example, they are extremely enthusiastic about a spelling bee at a cocktail party. Although child prodigies are often rich in both talent and ambition, what holds them back from changing the world is that they don't know how to be original or different. So when they perform at Carnegie Hall, win science Olympiads, or become chess champions, the tragedy occurs. Practice makes them perfect, but doesn't create anything new. They learn Mozart's sparkling melodies and Beethoven's beautiful symphonies, but they themselves can never compose unique music. They focus their energy on absorbing existing scientific knowledge, but don't create new concepts. They adapt to the rules of pre-programmed games instead of inventing new ones. On their life's journey, they strive to gain their parents' satisfaction and their teachers' praise. Studies have shown that the most creative children are the least likely to be teachers' pets. In one study, elementary school teachers listed their most and least favorite students, then evaluated both groups across a catalog of traits. The least favorite students were disobedient. They made their own rules. Teachers tended to discriminate against highly creative students, labeling them as troublemakers. To survive in class, these children quickly learned to adapt to the curriculum set by their teachers, but kept their unique ideas to themselves. As William Derryzewix would put it, they would become the world's most excellent sheep. In adulthood, many prodigies become experts in their fields and leaders in their organizations. However, only a few of these child geniuses become true innovators. Psychologist Ellen Winner lamented, "They suffer a painful transition from a child who learns quickly and easily in an established environment to an adult who is capable of building their own career." Most prodigies never make those leaps. They apply their extraordinary abilities in conventional ways, doing work without questioning what exists or is defaulted, or making no new waves. In every field they enter, they maintain a certain level of safety by following conventional paths to success. They become ordinary doctors who make no effort to reform a flawed healthcare system that prevents many patients from paying for care that was deficient from the start. They become lawyers defending clients for violating outdated laws without trying to change the laws. They become teachers who prepare lesson plans without ever asking what their students are learning for. Although we rely on them to keep the world running smoothly, they make us operate as if we are on a treadmill. Prodigies often lack the drive for achievement. To succeed, they must be responsible for creating the world's greatest achievements. When we are determined to excel, we are motivated to work harder, more persistently, and smarter. But when a culture is filled with a significant number of achievements, originality manifests in a few other characteristics. However, the urge for very high achievement can overshadow originality. The more you desire achievement, the more you fear failure. Instead of aiming for one-of-a-kind achievements, the intense desire for success makes us settle for safe, and therefore unremarkable, results. Psychologists Todd Lubart and Robert Sternberg noted that once people pass a moderate threshold of achievement motivation, they become less creative. The drive for success, coupled with the fear of failure, has hindered the emergence of history's greatest innovators and change-makers. Concerned with maintaining stability and achieving conventional accomplishments, they don't pursue originality. Instead of being fully prepared for the journey ahead, they are swayed, persuaded, and forced to carve out their own niche. If a critical mass of people were not convinced to engage in original behavior, the United States might not exist. The civil rights movement might only be a dream. The Sistine Chapel ceiling might be bare. We might still believe the sun revolves around the earth, and personal computers might never have become globally widespread. From our vantage point today, the Declaration of Independence seems like a sure thing, but it almost didn't happen due to the reluctance of key revolutionaries. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jack Rakove recounts that those who played commanding roles in the American Revolution were not like revolutionaries, but rather people with vivid imaginations. They only became self-sacrificing revolutionaries later. In the years leading up to the war, John Adams feared British retaliation and hesitated to abandon his nascent legal career. He only began participating after being elected a delegate to the First Continental Congress. George Washington focused on managing his wheat, flour, fish, and stud horse businesses. He only became involved in the dispute after Adams nominated him as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. "I have made every effort to avoid participating in these wars," Washington wrote. Nearly 2 centuries later, Martin Luther King Jr. worried about leading the civil rights movement. He only dreamed of becoming a pastor and university president. In 1955, the movement suddenly erupted after a black woman, Rosa Parks, was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man, as mandated by Jim Crow laws. They agreed to form the Montgomery Improvement Association and launch the bus boycott. And one of the attendees nominated King to be the association's president. King said it happened so fast that "I didn't even have time to think. I think if I had time to think, I probably would have declined." Just 3 weeks earlier, King and his wife, Coretta, had agreed that "I should not take on any heavy community responsibilities because I had to finish my dissertation and needed to focus more on my church work." He was anonymously elected to lead the bus boycott. When faced with the task of speaking to the community that evening, he said, "I was genuinely gripped by fear." But King soon overcame those anxieties, and by 1963, his powerful voice helped unite a nation with a vision of freedom. But that only happened when a colleague of King's suggested that he deliver the concluding speech at the March on Washington and assembled a coalition of leaders to lobby for him. When Pope Julius II asked Michelangelo to paint a fresco on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo was uninterested because he considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, and found the work so suffocating that he fled to Florence. It took 2 years, and the Pope's persistence for Michelangelo to complete the painting. And astronomy stagnated for decades because Nicolaus Copernicus refused to publish his initial discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun. Fearing rejection and ridicule, he kept the secret for 22 years and only shared his findings with friends. Finally, a reputable cardinal learned of his work and wrote a letter encouraging Copernicus to publish it. Even then, Copernicus delayed for another 4 years. His masterpiece only saw the light of day a day after a young mathematics professor personally took charge of the matter, turning Copernicus's theory into a book and publishing it under his own name. Nearly half a century later, an angel investor suggested to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak that he would pour $250,000 into Apple in 1977, but with an ultimatum. Wozniak had to leave Hewlett-Packard. Wozniak refused. "I'll work my whole life for Hewlett-Packard. I really don't want to start my own company, I'm scared," he admitted. But Wozniak changed his mind after receiving encouragement from Steve Jobs and many friends and his parents. Can you imagine how many Wozniaks, Michelangelos, and Kings gave up pursuing, publicizing, or promoting original ideas because it wasn't their vision? While we may not all wish to start our own companies, create masterpieces, change Western thought, or lead a civil rights movement, we can certainly come up with ideas to improve our workplaces, schools, and communities. Sadly, many of us hesitate to act on these new ideas. According to the renowned economist Joseph Schumpeter, originality is an act of creative destruction. Advocating for new systems often requires breaking outdated ways of working and overcoming the fear of venturing into the unknown. Among nearly 1,000 scientists at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, over 40% feared retaliation if they spoke out publicly about drug safety and food hygiene issues. Among over 40,000 employees at a technology company, half of them felt unsafe expressing dissenting opinions at work. When interviewing employees in consulting, financial services, media, pharmaceutical, and advertising companies, 85% chose to remain silent about their concerns rather than report them to their superiors. The last time you had an original idea, what did you do with it? Although America is a land that celebrates individualism and self-expression, in the pursuit of perfection and in the fear of failure, most of us choose to conform rather than excel. Thomas Jefferson advised that regarding personal style, in matters of style, swim with the current, in matters of principle, stand like a rock. The pressure to be perfect makes us do the opposite. We express originality in superficial ways, wearing a bow tie, bright red shoes without daring to embrace the risks of true originality. When powerful ideas and core values come to mind, we censor ourselves. Renowned senior executive Melody Hobson said, "There's very little originality in life because people are afraid to speak up and afraid to stand out." So what habits help people move beyond superficial originality to true inner originality? The right thing. To be original, you need to take breakthrough risks. This belief is so ingrained in our cultural spirit that we rarely stop to think about it. We admire astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride for the right reasons because they bravely left the only planet humanity inhabits and ventured into space. We applaud heroes like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who, driven by strong convictions, risk their lives for cherished moral principles. We idolize icons like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates for dropping out of college, enduring multiple bankruptcies, and living in garages to resolutely turn their technological visions into reality. When we marvel at the unique individuals who sparked creativity and drove changes in the world, we tend to assume they are very different. It's like assuming some people are lucky enough to be born with genetic mutations that make them resistant to cancer, obesity, and HIV. Thus, we believe that great innovators are born with a biological immunity to risk. They are thought to embrace uncertainty and disregard social approval. They simply don't worry about the consequences of nonconformity. They are programmed to break beliefs, incite rebellion, create disruptive revolutions, operate independently, going against the trend, unaffected by fear, rejection, or ridicule. The term entrepreneur, coined by economist Richard Cantillon, literally means risk-taker. When we read the story of Warby Parker's rapid rise, this issue becomes clearer than ever. Like all great innovators, this quartet changed the world because they were willing to take a leap of faith. After all, if you don't jump over the fence, you can't get into the house, right? 6 months before Warby Parker launched, one of the founders sat in my Wharton classroom, tall, with a friendly face, curly black hair, and a calm demeanor. Neil Blumenthal achieved these feats because everything he did came from a nonprofit purpose. He genuinely yearned to create a better world. When he presented the company's idea to me, like many skeptics, I told him it was an interesting idea, but it was hard to imagine people ordering glasses online. As a skeptical consumer, I knew it would take an extraordinary effort to build a company from scratch. But when I learned that Neil and his friends had dedicated all their time to preparing for the launch, all my thoughts about their failure completely vanished. My first objection against them was when I talked to Neil. If they truly believed in Warby Parker's success, they should have dropped out of school to dedicate all their time to making the idea a reality. Neil replied, "We wanted to hedge our bets. We weren't sure if it was a good idea, and there were no signs of success. So, we spent all our free time during our college years researching it." We were 4 friends before we started, and we agreed that frank work communication was more important than success. But by summer, they were allowed to focus full-time on the business. "What about the other 3?" Neil admitted. "We all took internships. I went into consulting, Andy into venture capital, and Dave into healthcare." Due to limited time and divided focus, they still hadn't completed the company website, and it took them 6 months to agree on a company name. At 2 points, I showed them a second yellow card of skepticism. However, before completely refusing to join the project, I remembered they were all graduating at the end of the year. That meant they could finally dedicate all their time and work together on this business venture. Neil changed his view. Yes, but that's not necessary. We remain neutral. Only if this project didn't work would we accept full-time jobs after graduation. Jeffrey did the same. And to ensure he had many options, Dave did 2 different internships over the summer and told his employers he might return to work later. My third objection, they backed down, and so did I. I became a professor because I'm passionate about exploring new ideas, sharing knowledge, and teaching future generations of students. But in my most authentic moments, I also yearn to break out of the comfort zone of my current job. I never had the confidence to start a business in my 20s. If I had the chance, I would definitely have stayed in school and taken a job related to my background. When I compared Warby Parker's path to the image of successful entrepreneurs in my mind, they didn't match. Neil and his associates lacked the courage to embark on that path with a burning conviction, making me doubt their belief and commitment. They weren't serious enough about becoming successful entrepreneurs. They weren't risky enough for a fight. In my mind, they would fail because they played it too safe instead of fully betting on the project. But in reality, this was precisely why they succeeded. I want to debunk the imaginary notion that originality requires extreme risk-taking and convince you that true originality goes far beyond what we perceive. In every field, from business to politics to science and art, those who drive the world forward with their unique ideas are rarely models of unwavering conviction and commitment. When they challenge tradition and the status quo, they project boldness and self-confidence externally. But peel away that veneer, and the truth is they too wrestle with fear, internal conflict, and self-doubt. We see them as initiators, but their efforts are often spurred and sometimes coerced by others. And the more they appear to embrace risk, the more they actually seek to avoid it. In an interesting study, 2 management researchers, Joseph Raffi and G.F. Sorensen, posed a simple question. When starting a business, should you keep or quit your day job? From 1994 to 2018, they tracked a nationwide survey group of over 5,000 Americans in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s who had become entrepreneurs. The results showed that whether they kept or quit their day jobs, these founders were not driven by financial needs. Individuals with high household incomes or high salaries were less likely to quit their jobs to become full-time entrepreneurs. A survey found that the riskiest people are those who take risks with the highest confidence. Entrepreneurs who remained neutral by starting a business while keeping their day jobs were those who resisted risk and self-uncertainty. If you think like most people, you would predict a clear advantage for those who take risks with the highest confidence. However, the study showed precisely the opposite. Entrepreneurs who kept their day jobs had a 33% lower failure rate than those who quit entirely to focus on their startups. If you are risk-averse but doubt the feasibility of your idea, put off starting your business. If you are a wild gambler, starting a business will be much more precarious. Like the leadership of Warby Parker, the entrepreneurs whose companies topped Fast Company's recent list of most innovative companies kept their day jobs even after their companies launched. Former track star Phil Knight began selling running shoes out of the trunk of his car in 1964, but kept his accounting job until 1969. After inventing the first Apple computer, Steve Wozniak teamed up with Steve Jobs to form a company in 1976, but he continued to work full-time at Hewlett-Packard until 1977. And although Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin found a way to significantly improve internet search engines in 1996, they did not abandon their graduate studies at Stanford until 1998. Page said, "We almost didn't start Google because we were so worried about dropping out of our PhD program." In 1997, fearing that their fledgling search engine would distract them from their research, they tried to sell Google for less than $2 million in cash and stock. Fortunately, potential buyers rejected the offer. The habit of keeping a day job isn't limited to business success. Many influential creative minds maintain full-time jobs or pursue their studies even after earning income from major projects. Ava DuVernay, director of Selma produced her first 3 films while still working as a journalist. She only pursued filmmaking full-time after making films for 4 years and winning numerous awards. Brian May was pursuing a PhD in astrophysics when he started playing guitar in a new band, but he didn't abandon his research until several years later to dedicate his entire career to the rock band Queen. Not long after, he wrote, "We Will Rock You." Grammy-winning artist John Legend released his first album in 2004, but continued working as a management consultant until 2002. He still prepared PowerPoint presentations by day and performed at night. Horror writer Stephen King was a teacher, janitor, and gas station attendant for 7 years after writing his first story. He only quit after his debut novel, Carrie Asterisk, was published for a year. Scott Adams, creator of the humorous comic strip Dilbert Asterisk, worked at Pacific Bell for 7 years after his first comic strip gained significant popularity. Why do all these prominent figures of originality maintain safety in their careers instead of taking risks like stock portfolios? Half a century ago, psychologist Clyde Coombs at the University of Michigan developed a groundbreaking theory of risk. In the stock market, if you plan to enter a risky investment, you protect yourself by maintaining safety in other investments. Coombs suggested that in everyday life, successful people deal with risk in a similar way, through balancing portfolios. When we take risks in one area, we generally tend to compensate for those risks by being more cautious in other areas. If you're going to bet a lot of money on one hand, you'll drive slower on the way to the casino. The risk portfolio explains why we often become original in one area while being quite conventional in other areas of life. Baseball executive branch Rickey signed Jackie Robinson to his team, breaking the color barrier, but refused to attend baseball games on Sundays, avoided profanity, and abstained from alcohol. T.S. Eliot's career-defining work, The Waste Land Asterisk, is hailed as one of the most influential poems of the 20th century. But after its publication in 1922, Eliot continued his work at a London bank until 1925 because he refused to take professional risks. Novelist Aldous Huxley noted after a visit to Eliot's office, "Eliot is the most brilliant of all the bank clerks here." When he officially left his banking job, Eliot still didn't abandon his day job. He spent the next 40 years working for a publisher to secure his livelihood. On the other hand, he continued to write poetry. Polaroid founder Edwin Land once remarked, "No one can be original in one area without having emotional and social stability in all other areas." But does a day job distract us from doing our most original work? The common view is that creative achievements cannot flourish without intense focus of time and energy, and companies cannot thrive without strong efforts. These assumptions underestimate the core benefit of a balanced risk system. The need for safety in one area can provide the freedom to be original in another. By having a solid financial base, we can escape the pressure to publish immature books, sell mediocre artwork, or launch untested business models. When Pierre Omidyar built eBay, it was simply a hobby. He continued working as a programmer for the next 9 months and only quit when he earned more income from eBay. Excellent entrepreneurs are not risk maximizers. Linda Rottenberg, co-founder and CEO of Endeavor, realized this based on decades of experience coaching the world's biggest entrepreneurs. They take the risk out of risk-taking. Managing a balanced risk portfolio doesn't mean perpetually hovering in the middle by taking moderate risks. Instead, original success involves taking maximum risks in one area and being more cautious in others. At 27, Sarah Blakely conceived the idea for form-fitting capri pants. She took a huge risk by investing all her $5,000 savings. To balance her risk portfolio, she maintained a full-time job selling fax machines for the next 2 years, then spent evenings and weekends designing prototypes, saving money by writing her own patent application instead of hiring a lawyer. Finally, after founding Spanx, she became the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. A century earlier, Henry Ford began building his automotive empire while still working as chief engineer for Thomas Edison. The job gave him the necessary security to experiment with new automobile inventions. He continued working under Edison for 2 years after building his carburetor and 1 year after receiving a patent for it. What about Bill Gates? Didn't he famously drop out of prestigious Harvard University to start the Microsoft empire? Gates wrote his first software program as a sophomore. He waited a full year before leaving school. Even then, he didn't quit outright, but balanced his risk portfolio by taking a leave of absence. Entrepreneur Rick Smith noted, "Instead of being one of the world's greatest risk takers, Bill Gates is more accurately seen as one of the greatest risk minimizers." This risk minimization model made a breakthrough for Warby Parker. Two of the co-founders, Neil Blumenthal and Dave Gilboa, became co-CEOs of the company. They rejected the standard advice to choose a single leader, believing it would be safer to have 2 people in leadership positions. This co-CEO model generated positive market reactions and increased the company's value from the start. "Priority number 1 has to be risk minimization," Dave said. "Warby Parker was not the basket into which I wanted to put all my eggs." After founding the company, he continued to explore other business opportunities by monitoring scientific discoveries within the university to assess their commercial potential. Providing backup options helped the founders gain confidence in an unproven assumption. Would people be willing to buy glasses online? Instead of merely acknowledging these uncertainties, they actively worked to mitigate the risks. "We constantly discussed ways to mitigate business risks," Neil said. "This entire journey was a series of should and should not decisions. At every stage, we conducted checks and balances." The 4 friends participated in a business class and spent months refining their business plan to minimize risk. To make customers more comfortable with the unfamiliar method of buying glasses online, they decided to offer free returns. But individual and group surveys showed people were still hesitant to order glasses online. Neil recalled, "Many people didn't order. That really made us doubt the entire business plan. That was the moment we lost significant faith." That brought them back to the original plan. After lengthy discussions, the team came up with a solution: implement a free home try-on program. Customers could order frame samples without any financial commitment, simply returning them if they didn't like them. This plan would actually be less expensive than the previous free returns. If a customer previously bought frames with lenses and then returned them, Warby Parker would lose a lot of money because lenses were custom designed for each frame. But if customers only tried on frame samples and returned them, the company could reuse them. Now, Dave was confident and committed. "I decided that we had to be prepared to dedicate all our time to this work. That wasn't a risk. It wasn't like I was taking a big leap of faith." The free home try-on program was so popular that Warby Parker had to temporarily suspend it within 48 hours of its launch. The risk-averse innovator. There's growing evidence that entrepreneurs are not as risk-loving as most of us. And that's a rare conclusion that all economists, sociologists, and psychologists have actually agreed upon. In a study surveying over 800 Americans, entrepreneurs and employed adults were asked to choose one of 3 desired investment portfolios. A portfolio generating $5 million in profit with a 20% chance of success. B, a portfolio generating $2 million in profit with a 50% chance of success. C, a portfolio generating $1.25 million in profit with an 80% chance of success. Entrepreneurs were more likely to choose the last option, the safest choice. This held true regardless of income, wealth, age, gender, business experience, marital status, education, household size, and expectations of how other businesses would perform. The authors concluded, "We found that entrepreneurs are more risk-averse than the general population." This is just the result of an optional survey. But when you look at the actual behavior of entrepreneurs, you'll find how much they avoid dangerous risks. Economists found that from adolescence, successful entrepreneurs broke rules and defied prohibitions 3 times more often than their peers. However, when you look deeper into their specific business-related behaviors, when establishing manufacturing companies, these adolescents only took calculable risks. When psychologists studied American twins and Swedish citizens, this research yielded similar results. Through these 3 studies, those who became successful entrepreneurs often had an adolescence that defied parental advice, hung out with friends despite curfews, skipped school, stole, gambled, drank alcohol, and smoked marijuana. However, they did not engage in dangerous activities like drunk driving, buying illegal drugs, or stealing valuable items. All of this was true regardless of their socioeconomic status or their parents' household income. Originality manifests in attitudes toward risk. Some people love skydiving while others are terrified. To be original, you need to try new things, which means taking some risks. But the most successful originality doesn't come from those who are fearless, who just jump before looking. They are those who reluctantly tiptoe to the edge of the cliff, calculate the slope, double-check their parachute 3 times, and set up a safety net below, a fallback in any situation. As Malcolm Gladwell wrote in The New Yorker, many entrepreneurs take risks, but most of them fail. They're not success stories. Disregarding social conventions is not the differentiating factor that leads people down an original path. In a comprehensive analysis of 60 studies involving over 15,000 entrepreneurs, those who cared less about pleasing others were often less likely to become entrepreneurs or make breakthroughs for their companies. We can see a similar pattern in politics. When hundreds of historians, psychologists, and political scientists commented on U.S. presidents, they found that the weakest leaders were those who followed the will of the people and the precedents set by their predecessors. The greatest presidents were those who dared to challenge the status quo and brought about rapid changes to improve many of the country's problems. Yet these behaviors were completely unrelated to whether they had a deep concern for public approval and social harmony. Abraham Lincoln is often known as the greatest president in U.S. history. When experts rated presidents based on the desire to please others and avoid conflict, Lincoln scored highest on the list. He spent 4 hours a day handling office work with citizens and pardoned Civil War deserters. Before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln wrestled for over 6 months with the decision of whether to free the slaves. He wondered if he had the constitutional authority to do so. He worried that his decisions could lose the support of the southern border states, create more war, and devastate the country. Originality is not a fixed trait. It is a free choice. Lincoln was not innately original, so engaging in unprogrammed debates was not in his genes but an act of conscious will. The great thinker W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "He was one of us, and he became Abraham Lincoln." Often, control is lost within our own daily work and lives. Several years ago, Google asked Amy Rusniski, a talented professor at Yale University, to help with a series of administrative and sales tasks. These were jobs where the person performing them lacked the freedom, perception, status, or opportunity to participate in exciting projects like the company's engineers. I traveled with her and another colleague, Justin Berg, to California, New York, Dublin, and London in search of solutions. Many employees were so dedicated to Google that they revealed they accepted their jobs as defaults because they believed that the work and interactions with others in their jobs created a solid foundation that they didn't question whether they needed to adjust them. To unlock that mindset, we collaborated with Jennifer Kurkowski and Brian Well, 2 innovators behind Google's people analytics work. We designed a workshop for hundreds of employees, hoping to share that work is not a static sculpture, but a flexible assembly block. We provided examples of people who became architects of their own jobs, customizing their tasks and relationships to better fit their interests, skills, and values. Like an artistic salesperson who volunteered to design a new logo, and a financial analyst who communicated with clients via video chat instead of email. Ultimately, they looked at their familiar work in an entirely new light. Vujita, facing the familiar in a new perspective. They offered new and more ideal ways of looking at their roles while remaining grounded in reality. Managers and colleagues evaluated each employee's performance and happiness before the workshop, then weeks and months later. The entire experience lasted only 90 minutes, so we weren't sure if it would make any difference. However, after 6 weeks, Google employees randomly selected to express their thoughts about their jobs showed signs of happiness and improved work performance. After considering ways to adjust their work, they immediately acted to improve it. Employees in the control group who did not attend the workshops showed no changes in happiness or performance. When we added an element to encourage employees to view their skills and work more flexibly, the results lasted at least 6 months. Instead of just using their existing abilities, they initiated developing new capabilities to create creative and personalized work. As a result, they were 70% more likely to be promoted or transferred to desirable new roles than their colleagues. By refusing to stick to default jobs and skills, they became happier and more effective, upgrading themselves to better fit new roles and gradually realizing and overcoming their limitations. After revealing that originality achieves success often by questioning the defaults in life and balancing a risk portfolio, the rest of this book will present how to narrow the gap between perception and action. When you have a new idea, how do you fight to turn it into a result? As an organizational psychologist at Wharton, I have spent over a decade researching originality in a range of established systems, from tech companies and banks to schools, hospitals, and government offices. I have also found some cases that exemplify the extraordinary originality of this era and want to share the stories of these wise individuals so that each of us can become more original without harming our relationships, reputations, and careers. I hope these findings will help you develop the courage and strategy to pursue originality, providing the leadership knowledge needed to create a culture of originality in your teams and organizations. Using research and stories from all fields from business to politics to sports and entertainment, I will focus on the seeds of creative, ethical, and organizational change, along with the barriers that impede progress. The first part of this book focuses on managing proposed risks, identifying and expressing original ideas. By definition, new ideas are full of uncertainty, and strong evidence describes how we hone our skills in separating the wheat from the chaff to avoid the risks of betting on bad ideas and overlooking good ones. Once you've conceived a potential idea, the next step is to present its effectiveness. I'll share some best practices to clarify how you choose your messages and which people you need to consult to be heard more and criticized less. Throughout the journey, you'll discover why the most popular TV show of all time was almost canceled, why an entrepreneur shared his startup story by highlighting reasons no one should invest in them, how a CIA analyst convinced her intelligence community to stop being so secretive, and how a woman 3 levels below at Apple challenged Steve Jobs and won. The second part of the book addresses choices aimed at achieving originality. I'll start with timing. Be cautious about being a pioneer, as acting early often carries more risks. Surprisingly, some of the greatest creative achievements and history-changing innovations stemmed from procrastination. The tendency to delay and postpone helped entrepreneurs build long-lasting companies, leaders pioneer transformative efforts, and innovators maintain their originality. Then I'll return to the challenges of coalition building, exploring how to increase support for an original idea and minimize the risk of rejection. The unsung heroes of the women's suffrage movement will illustrate why enemies make better allies than frenemies, and how shared values can be divisive rather than unifying. A founder who hid his company's mission from employees and a Hollywood director who adapted Disney cartoons will demonstrate how to recruit collaborators by balancing idealism with pragmatism and blending the familiar with the new. The third part of the book concerns unlocking and sustaining originality in both life and work. I will explore how to nurture originality in children, explaining how parents, siblings, and role models shape children's rebellious tendencies. You'll learn why the home run trots, the number of home runs professional baseball players hit, correlate with their birth order. America's greatest comedians share common family backgrounds. Those who risked their lives to carry out brave rescues during the Holocaust were often disciplined rigorously by their parents. A nation's innovation and economic growth can stem from the books we read to our children. From there, I will examine why some cultures worship tradition and how leaders encourage dissenting opinions, allowing originality and difference to flourish. You'll learn a lot from a brilliant financial billionaire who fired employees for not criticizing him, an inventor who struggled to disseminate his achievements, and an expert who helped change unwritten norms at NASA after the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. I will conclude with reflections on the emotional factors that prevent us from pursuing originality. You will gain insight into managing fear and indifference from a group of 20-somethings who fought to overthrow a dictator, and a lawyer who battled climate change while swimming in the Arctic. These examples demonstrate that silence is not the best way to conquer anxiety, but is counterproductive when we are angry, and that pessimism can sometimes bring more energy than optimism. Ultimately, it is those who dare to challenge the status quo who drive the world forward. After years of researching and interacting with them, I find their internal experiences are no different from ours. They feel the same fears and doubts as most of us. What makes them different is that they act anyway. Deep down, they realize that even if they fail, they will regret it less than not trying at all. Part 2. The astute investor and the blind investor. The art and science of identifying original ideas. At the turn of the century, an invention took Silicon Valley by storm. Steve Jobs called it the greatest piece of technology since the personal computer. Thrilled by the invention, Jobs offered to invest $63 million for a 10% stake in the company. When the inventor refused, Jobs did something uncharacteristic. He offered free consultation to the inventor for the next 6 months. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos reviewed the product and was immediately captivated. "You have a revolutionary product. You won't have any problem selling this invention." Legendary investor John Doerr, who successfully backed Google and many other startups, poured $80 million into the venture. He predicted it would be the fastest company to reach $1 billion and more influential than the internet itself. The inventor himself was described as a modern-day Thomas Edison, possessing a remarkable list of groundbreaking inventions. His portable kidney dialysis machine was voted Medical Product of the Year. His portable infusion pump reduced patient hospital stays. And his coronary stent invention was used to open Vice President Dick Cheney's heart. He had accumulated hundreds of patents and received America's highest honor in invention, the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, from President Bill Clinton. The inventor predicted that within 1 year, sales of his latest product would reach 10,000 units per week. However, 6 years later, they had sold a total of only about 30,000 units. Over a decade passed, and the company was still not profitable. Though hailed as a product that would profoundly change people and cities, to this day it is only used in niche markets. That product was the Segway, a self-balancing personal two-wheeled transporter. Time magazine called it one of the decade's 10 biggest failed gadgets. Doerr admitted in 2013, "Segway was a flat-out failure of an investment. I was wrong in some of my rather bold predictions about Segway." Why did such knowledgeable business minds miss the signs of failure? Several years earlier, 2 comedians produced a 90-minute TV special together. Lacking experience in writing TV programs and quickly running out of resources, they pivoted to the idea of a weekly 30-minute show. When they submitted the script, most networks disliked or rejected it. One of the actors in the show described it as a fun mess. They filmed a test episode for an audience review. 100 audience members gathered in Los Angeles to discuss the show's strengths and weaknesses. They dismissed and deemed the show a dismal failure. One audience member bluntly declared, "He's just a loser. Who wants to watch him perform?" After the show was screened for about 600 other audience members in 4 different cities, the summary report was as follows. No audience member was eager to watch this show again. The performance was rated as too weak. Subsequent pilot episodes aired and, as predicted, made no impact. Through the show's effect and negative audience reviews, the show was truly in trouble, but one network encouraged the filmmakers to make 4 more episodes. The show didn't air live until almost a year after the pilot. And once again, they failed to attract enthusiastic supporters. At the last minute, the network arranged to air half of this episode as a replacement for a canceled show. But then, one of the writers thought about giving up. They had no more ideas, but the good news is he later changed his mind and continued writing the script. In the decades that followed, the show became a dominant fixture on the Nielsen ratings and generated over $1 billion in revenue. The show became the most popular television series in America and was honored by TV Guide as the greatest show of all time. If you've ever complained about someone talking too close to you, chastised a partygoer for double-dipping a chip into a shared bowl of dip, and warned them, "There's nothing wrong with that," or refused someone by saying, "No dip for you," that's when you're using phrases from the show *Seinfeld*. So why did TV network executives have so little faith in *Seinfeld*? When we lament the lack of originality in this world, we often blame a deficit of creativity. Only by generating many new ideas can we hope for things to get better. But in reality, the biggest barrier to originality isn't generating ideas, but selecting them. In one analysis, over 200 people conceived more than 1,000 ideas for new projects and products. 87% of those ideas were highly original. Companies, communities, and nations are not short of ideas. They simply lack excellent people who can choose new ideas correctly. Segway is a classic case of a false positive idea predicted to be a hit, but turned out not to be. Seinfeld reflects a false negative predicted to fail, but ultimately became a huge success. This chapter will address the barriers and best practices in idea selection to minimize betting on bad ideas. I have found skilled forecasters, people who have learned to avoid both false positives and false negatives. You will have the opportunity to meet two venture capitalists who predicted Segway's failure and an NBC executive who didn't even work in comedy, but enthusiastically supported and funded Seinfeld *. Their method is to study the relative importance of intuition and analysis in evaluating ideas, as well as how to assess the passion of the people behind these ideas. You will understand why managers and audiences find it difficult to accurately evaluate new ideas and how we can make better decisions when seizing an opportunity. The creative tightrope walk. The inventor of the Segway was a technology expert named Dean Kamen, whose wardrobe consisted of a single uniform: denim shirt, jeans, and work boots. When I asked venture capitalists to describe Kamen, their most common reaction was, "A wizard." At 16, he single-handedly redesigned a museum's lighting system and persuaded the president to implement it. In the 1970s, he invented a portable infusion pump that brought him enough profit to buy a jet, a helicopter, and a mansion in New Hampshire, complete with a computer store, an electronics lab, and a baseball field. In the 1980s, his portable kidney dialysis machine achieved resounding success. In the 1990s, Kamen designed the iBot, a wheelchair that could climb stairs. Recognizing the widespread applicability of this technology, he and his team created the Segway. The purpose of this design was to build a fuel-efficient and safe vehicle to prevent pollution and help individuals navigate crowded cities. Because the vehicle was small, lightweight, and self-balancing, it was not only suitable for mail carriers, police, and golfers, but also had the potential to fundamentally change how people move every day. Segway was the greatest technology Kamen had ever created, and he predicted that Segway's competition with cars would be similar to cars' competition with horse-drawn carriages. But can creators ever be objective targets for others to evaluate their own creative ideas? One of my former students, Justin Berg, now a talented professor at Stanford University, has researched this issue for years. Berg specializes in creative forecasting, the art of predicting the success of novel ideas. In one study, he showed circus performance videos to different groups of people and asked them to predict how popular each act would be. Circus artists from Cirque du Soleil and other troupes predicted the popularity of videos featuring themselves. Circus managers also watched the videos and made their predictions. To test the accuracy of the predictions, Berg measured the actual success of each performance by tracking the number of audience members who liked, shared, and sponsored the videos. He invited over 13,000 people to rate the videos. They also had the opportunity to share the videos via Facebook, Twitter, Google+, email, and received a 10-cent bonus which they could then donate to the performers. The creators felt very bad knowing the audience's ratings for their own performances. On average, when ranking their own videos compared to the performances of 9 other circus artists, they placed themselves too high. Managers, however, were more realistic. They kept a distance from the performances and viewed them more neutrally. Social scientists have long known that people tend to be overconfident when evaluating themselves. Here are some highlights of those findings. High school seniors. 70% reported having above-average leadership skills compared to 2% below average. For ability to cooperate with others, 25% rated themselves in the top 1% and 60% in the top 10%. College professors. 94% rated themselves as performing above average. Engineers at 2 different companies. 32% and 42% rated themselves in the top 5% of best employees. Entrepreneurs. When 3,000 small business owners rated the probability of success for various companies, they rated their own business prospects at an average of 8.1 out of 10, but only rated similar businesses at 5.9 out of 10. Overconfidence can be a particularly difficult bias to overcome in creative fields. When you come up with a new idea, by definition, it is unique. You dismiss all past feedback on previous ideas. Even if your previous ideas failed, you assume this idea is different. When developing an idea, we often focus too much on our own tastes and forget the audience's tastes to make accurate assessments. We get intoxicated in the eureka moment or the joy of overcoming an obstacle. Brandon Tartikoff, senior president of NBC's entertainment division, frequently reminded his producers, "No one walks in here with a bad idea." To some extent, entrepreneurs and inventors must truly believe in the success rate of their ideas, otherwise, they wouldn't have enough motivation to pursue them. But even after learning about audience preferences, they can easily fall victim to what psychologists call confirmation bias, focusing on the strengths of ideas, ignoring or downplaying their limitations. After a career researching creative productivity, psychologist Dean Simonton found that even geniuses struggled with recognition after achieving resounding success. In music, Beethoven was known as a self-aware critic. However, as Simonton noted, Beethoven's favorite symphonies, sonatas, and string quartets are not the ones most frequently performed and recorded by posterity. In one analysis, psychologist Aaron Cosby meticulously studied letters in which Beethoven evaluated 70 of his works and compared them with professional critics' assessments of these works. Of the 70 works, Beethoven confirmed 15 were false positives, expected to be great but turned out to be less successful, and 8 were false negatives, criticized but became excellent. This 33% error rate occurred despite the fact that Beethoven made many of his evaluations after receiving audience feedback. If creators knew when they were on the path to creating masterpieces, their work would only move forward. They would stop trying to generate ideas once they knew they had succeeded. But over time, Simonton found that they would return to and repeat what they had discarded prematurely. In Beethoven's most famous work, the Fifth Symphony, he discarded the end of the first movement because he found it too short and only reused it later. If Beethoven could distinguish a brilliant detail from an ordinary one, he would immediately have known this piece of music would be a success. When Picasso painted his famous asterisk Guernica in protest of fascism, he created 79 different versions. Many of these were based on his initial sketches, not later variations. The later sketches proved themselves to be dead ends, which the artist didn't know while creating. Simonton explained, if Picasso could evaluate his creations as he painted them, he would have more energy and use it for subsequent drawings. But in reality, he often became colder and more bored. To find a prince, you must kiss many frogs. If originality isn't about reliable assessments of idea quality, how do we maximize our chances of creating a masterpiece? Simonton found that creative geniuses, on average, don't produce higher quality in their field than their peers. They simply produce a greater volume of work, giving them more changes and a higher chance of being original. Simonton recorded that the probability of generating an influential or successful idea is a positive function of the total number of ideas generated. Look at Shakespeare. Most of us are familiar with his small number of classics, forgetting that over 2 decades he wrote 37 plays and 154 sonnets. Simonton tracked Shakespeare's popular plays, measuring how often they were performed and praised by experts and critics. Within 5 years, Shakespeare wrote 3 of his 5 most famous works, Macbeth *, King Lear *, and Othello *. He also produced mediocre works like Timon of Athens and All's Well That Ends Well, both ranked among his worst plays and heavily criticized for lacking refined language, incomplete plots, and underdeveloped characters. In every field, even the most renowned creators often produce a large number of technically good products that are not highly regarded by experts and customers. When the London Symphony Orchestra selected the 50 greatest classical music pieces, it included 6 by Mozart, 5 by Beethoven, and 3 by Bach. To create their very few masterpieces, Mozart composed over 600 works before his death at 35. Beethoven composed 650 works throughout his life, and Bach wrote over 1,000. In a study of over 15,000 classical music pieces, the more works a composer wrote within a 5-year period, the higher their chances of creating successful works. Picasso's artistic career included over 1,800 paintings, 1,200 sculptures, 2,800 ceramic pieces, and 12,000 drawings, not counting prints, floor coverings, and embroidery. Yet only a small fraction of these received public acclaim. In poetry, when we read Maya Angelou's classic poem, Still I Rise, we tend to forget that she wrote 165 other poems. We remember the moving memoir I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings Asterisk, but pay less attention to her 6 other autobiographies. In science, Einstein wrote sketches of general and special relativity that changed physics, but many of his 248 published works had very little impact. Ira Glass, producer of This American Life and the podcast serial Asterisk, said, "If you want to be original, the most important thing is to make a lot of work. Produce a huge volume of work." Across fields, Simonton also noted that those who write the most are not only the most original, but also create their most original works during their most prolific periods. In his 30s and 35s, Edison pioneered the invention of the light bulb, phonograph, and carbon telephone. But during that time, he filed over 100 patents for various other inventions, such as the electric stencil pen, fruit preservation techniques, using magnets to extract iron ore, and designing terrifying talking dolls. Periods with the smallest products also saw the greatest works. Simonton noted, despite having 1,093 patents, the number of Edison's achievements considered most creative can probably be counted on one's fingers. Assuming a balance between quantity and quality, if you want to create a better product, you should do less. But this turns out to be wrong. In reality, when it comes to generating ideas, quantity is the best predictor of quality. Robert Sutton, a professor at Stanford University, noted that original thinkers will come up with many bizarre ideas, dead ends, and complete failures. But those costs are completely worth it because they generate a large number of ideas, especially novel ones. Many people fail to achieve originality because they generate too few ideas and then obsess over perfecting them. At Upworthy, a company that specializes in making quality content go viral, 2 different employees wrote headlines for a video about monkeys' reactions to cucumber or grape rewards. 8,000 people watched the video with the headline, "Remember Planet of the Apes." It's closer to reality than you think. But the other person's headline attracted nearly 500,000 viewers, 59 times more than the first. That was, "Monkeys were paid unequally. See what happens." The rule at Upworthy is to come up with at least 25 headline ideas to find the most brilliant one. Previous studies suggested that talented people sometimes come up with new ideas earlier in the creative process. But for most of us, the first ideas are mostly conventional ones based on existing defaults. The Upworthy team wrote, "Once you start to despair, you'll think differently. The 24th idea is still nothing, but the 25th idea will be a gift from the headline god, and it will make you a legend." When working on the Segway, Dean Kamen recognized his blind variations as markers of creative progress. With over 440 patents to his name, he experienced many failures as well as successes. He often shared, "To find the prince of your life, you'll have to kiss a lot of frogs." In fact, the frog story was one of his mantras. He encouraged his engineers to try many different options to increase the chances of finding the right one. But he proceeded with the Segway before considering ideas for other transportation methods, losing sight of the fact that inventors must struggle hard to evaluate their creations. Ultimately, frog or prince. The best way to evaluate ideas more accurately is to gather feedback, share ideas, and see which ones are praised and accepted by the target audience. After decades of producing comedy, The Daily Show co-creator Liz Winstead still didn't know what would make an audience laugh. She recalled how desperate she was to find jokes, write them down, and perform them on stage. Some elicited only slight discussion, others made a huge splash. Now, with the help of social media, she has access to a faster feedback mechanism. When she comes up with a joke, she posts it on Twitter. When she writes a longer story, she posts it on Facebook. When she gets at least 25 retweets in less than a minute or a large number of shares on Facebook, she saves those comments. At the end of the day, she develops the posts that previously garnered the most reader recognition. Winstead shared, "Twitter and Facebook have helped me tremendously in knowing what people care about." When developing the segue, Dean Kamen didn't use this type of feedback because he was too concerned that others would steal his idea or that basic information would be released too early. He maintained strict secrecy. Many employees were not allowed access to the Segway development area. Only a select group of potential investors had the opportunity to see it. When building the vehicle, his team generated many ideas but lacked customer feedback to make the best choices for the final product. A device had to go through 3 or 4 iterative tests before reaching customers. Faith in ideas is extremely dangerous because it not only makes us prone to false positives, but also prevents the generation of the necessary diversity to achieve creative potential. But Kamen and his team weren't the only ones overly optimistic about the Segway. Where did masters like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, and John Doerr go wrong in evaluating this device? What caused executives and test audiences to fail in recognizing Seinfeld**'''''''''''''*s potential? Prisoners of prototypes and myopic preferences. When the first ****Seinfeld** script was sent to NBC, executives didn't know how to handle it. "It was truly unique," said Warren Littlefield, an NBC executive. "It was unlike any other TV show, a script unprecedented in history." In Justin Berg's study of circus performances, although circus managers predicted more accurately than the artists themselves, they were still not truly excellent forecasters, especially regarding creative behaviors. Managers tend to be risk-averse. They focus on the costs of investing in bad ideas rather than considering the benefits of experimenting with good ones. This can lead them to false negatives. The author of the first report on the **Seinfeld pilot found the show to be on the border between weak and moderate. He leaned towards moderate, but his boss rejected that opinion and rated it as weak. This type of false negative is common in the entertainment industry. Studio executives have overlooked works that later became huge hits, from **Star Wars** to E.T. to Pulp Fiction**. In publishing, managers have rejected works like The Chronicles of Narnia**, The Diary of Anne Frank**, Gone with the Wind**, Lord of the Flies**, and Harry Potter**. In 2015, J.K. Rowling's **Harry Potter alone grossed over $25 billion and sold more copies than any other book series. Stories of managers telling employees to stop working on projects that later achieved resounding success are documented in the annals of corporate innovation, from Nintendo's lead invention to Pontiac's Vero car to HP's electrostatic display product lines. Xbox was almost scrapped at Microsoft. The laser printer was almost canceled at Xerox for being too expensive and impractical. When faced with uncertainty, our first instinct is to reject new things and find reasons why they might fail. When managers review new ideas, it means they are evaluating them. To protect themselves from the risks of taking a bad bet, they compare new concepts with successful past prototypes. When publishing executives rejected Harry Potter**, they said it was too long for a children's book. When Brandon Tartikoff watched **Seinfeld**, he found it too Jewish and too New York to appeal to a broad audience. Professor Eric Dane found that the more specialized knowledge and experience people gain, the more specialized their worldview becomes. He pointed out in a study of professional card players that they struggled more than novices to adapt when the rules changed, and highly experienced accountants were often worse than newcomers at applying new tax laws. When we reach a certain level of understanding, we often become prisoners of our own prototypes. Generally, audiences are more open to new things than filmmakers. They don't have the blindness associated with expertise and don't face as much loss when considering a model for the first time and expressing enthusiasm for an original idea. However, in reality, Justin Berg found that test audiences didn't predict the success of new ideas any better than managers. When watching a show in your living room, you're immersed in the story. If you laugh throughout, it means you find it funny. However, when you watch it with a group, you don't react to the show in the same way. You are aware that you are there to evaluate it, not to experience it. so you evaluate the show from the very beginning. As you try to understand if people will watch it, you naturally judge it against established ideas for how such a show should be made. When the test audiences watched the Seinfeld pilot, they felt it lacked the community of Cheers *, the family dynamic of the Cosby Show *, and the narrative of *Alf*. In short, it was too easy to find flaws in a show that didn't stand out. Warren Littlefield remarked, "The truth is, most pilot episodes are not judged correctly because test audiences do not respond positively to new or different ideas. Audiences don't have enough experience. Simply because they haven't had the opportunity to see many new ideas generated in the writer's room before." Comedian Paul Reiser said, "The Seinfeld tests put an end to all discussions about testing. Please don't tell me this show will serve 20 people in 60 people in Sherman Oaks. I've never seen any test there that worked well." Therefore, neither test audiences nor managers are ideal evaluators of creative ideas. They are too prone to false negatives. They focus too much on reasons to reject an idea and cling to existing prototypes. We see that creators themselves struggle because they are often too optimistic about their own ideas. But there is a group of forecasters who seem to excel: the group of creators who evaluate other creators' ideas. In Berg's study of circus acts, the most accurate predictors of which videos would be liked, shared, and sponsored were their peers. When artists evaluated others' performances, they achieved twice the accuracy of managers and test audiences in predicting how often videos would be shared. Compared to creators, managers and test audiences were 56% and 55% more prone to false negatives when underestimating a new and outstanding performance, ranking it 5th or lower out of 10 shows watched. We often talk about the wisdom of crowds, but we need to carefully consider which crowd. On average, the combined predictions of over 120 circus managers were no better than the predictions of a single circus performer. Managers and test audiences tended to stick to their preferred genres and reject others. Creators were more open to different types of performances. They saw the potential in their colleagues, who not only did aerial and ground acrobatics, but were also talented puppeteers and mimes. Instead of trying to evaluate our own originality or seeking feedback from managers, we should regularly turn to our colleagues. They don't have the risk aversion of a manager or the test audience. They are open to seeing potential in unusual or original possibilities. This prevents them from falling into the false negative trap. At the same time, they don't have a significant investment in our ideas. This helps them maintain a distance for objective evaluation and protects them against false positives. This evidence helps explain why many artists receive audience acclaim but yearn for the admiration of their peers. Comedians often say the highest badge of honor is making their colleagues laugh. Magicians love to trick audiences, but they live to outwit their fellow magicians. The usual explanation for this preference is that we strive for our colleagues' recognition. But Berg's research shows that we rely on peer evaluations because they are the most trustworthy. When we evaluate new ideas, we can better avoid false negatives by thinking like creators. In a series of experiments, Berg surveyed over 1,000 adults about the success of new products on the market. Some products were based on useful ideas: a 3D projector, a natural ground simulating floor system, and an automatic bedsheet spreader. Other products were less practical, such as an electrically charged tablecloth to prevent ants from getting into food on a picnic. The remaining products were conventional ideas with varying useful features, from a portable container for steaming food in the microwave to a hands-free towel system. Berg wanted to increase people's chances of accurately rating a novel and useful idea from the start, as opposed to preferred conventional ideas. He randomly assigned half of the participants to think like managers, listing 3 criteria for evaluating new product success in 6 minutes. This group then accurately bet on novel and useful ideas 51% of the time. But the other group of participants was much more accurate. Their selection rate for the most promising ideas reached over 77%. They spent the first 6 minutes quite differently. Instead of applying a managerial mindset to evaluate ideas, they used a creative mindset by generating their own ideas. Simply spending 6 minutes developing original ideas made them more open to novelty. improving their ability to see potential in unusual or original things. From these findings, you might think we could improve idea selection simply by ensuring that managers have some creative experience. But in Berg's circus data, former artists who became managers did not significantly outperform regular managers in their evaluations. Pure artists remain the best forecasters. Once you take on a managerial role, it's hard to prevent an evaluative mindset from infiltrating your brain, leading to false negative judgments. Berg demonstrated this in an experiment by asking people to generate product ideas and then provide a list of evaluation criteria, then measuring the success of the ideas based on feedback from actual audiences. Thinking like creators, but wearing a manager's hat reduced forecast accuracy by 41%. When Berg reversed the order, listing evaluation criteria first and then generating ideas, accuracy increased to 65%. If we want to increase our chances of betting on the best original ideas, we must first generate our own ideas before filtering others' opinions. And this helps explain why Seinfeld saw the light of day. The double-edged sword of experience. When test audiences harshly criticized the Seinfeld pilot, Warren Littlefield said, "It felt like a knife plunged into my heart. We were afraid to move forward because our show was being vehemently rejected." Although the show was given opportunities to comedy writers, at that time, no one wanted to write the script. Yet Rick Ludwin, the person who eventually made the show happen, reaped enormous success. Ludwin later made his mark by advocating for comedian Conan O'Brien against Jay Leno and fighting to re-establish a show that initially failed to gain sufficient audience interest. But his greatest contribution to television was greenlighting the Seinfeld pilot. At that point in his career, Rick Ludwin didn't even work in the comedy department, but he had the ability to handle a variety of diverse issues. When the Seinfeld pilot failed, he immediately gave the show's creators another chance. He noticed he had a few hours free in his schedule, so he divided those slots into half-hour segments and took money from his own budget to order more episodes. Ludwin shared, "As far as we know, for a TV show, our show had the fewest episodes ever filmed." Jerry Seinfeld emphasized that a 6-episode show is like a slap in the face to the creators because it's too short. Yet NBC only ordered 4 episodes. Steve Jobs said in 1982, "If you want to make creative connections, you don't need to go through the same experiences as everyone else." Working outside the comedy production department might have been Rick Ludwin's greatest advantage. Ludwin recalled, "Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld had never written a sitcom, and my department had never developed a sitcom either. But we worked together quite well because we didn't know what rules we weren't supposed to break." An outsider's perspective helped him think independently, from the standard sitcom format to creating something different. Most sitcoms film consecutive scenes in a 22-minute episode, whereas Seinfeld often left conflicts unresolved and incorporated up to 20 different scenes. This was truly frustrating if you were used to working in the sitcom world, but completely comfortable for someone accustomed to different arrangements in each special. At the same time, Ludwin had the necessary experience in comedy production. As a producer in the 1970s, he wrote jokes and sold them to Bob Hope, and later produced segments for a daytime variety show. From these segments, a comedy show was conceived. He recalled, "The environment of comedy writers was like a fantasy baseball camp. You think you're really good until you step into the game. Not only can you not hit the ball, you can't even see the ball." I knew we weren't baseball players, but at least we spoke the same language. This is when people with moderate expertise in a specific field are open to radically creative ideas. Ludwin's deep experience in comedy gave him the necessary humor. His broad experience outside the sitcom genre helped him avoid the blindness against alternative filmmaking methods. Instead of meticulously examining what made a sitcom a hit, he took a broader view of understanding what made a comedy successful. You never know where the next big hit comes from. It could come from left field. If you think that might not happen because the producers don't have enough experience or there's no clue that it has ever happened, if you have these kinds of barriers in your mind, you'll miss something. One of the best things I did for myself was never develop a primetime comedy. But I was familiar with unusual ideas. I could see what had and hadn't been done. The time I read the Saturday Night Live, Script helped me be more open to unusual storylines, which became the legend of Seinfeld asterisk. The unique combination of broad and deep experience is crucial for creativity. In a recent study comparing Nobel laureates in science from 1901 to 2005 with typical scientists from the same period, both groups possessed strong expertise in their respective research fields. But Nobel laureates were more likely to have artistic inclinations than less accomplished scientists. Here are the results from a team of Michigan University researchers. They found a correlation between artistic engagement and Nobel laureates compared to ordinary scientists. A representative study of thousands of American entrepreneurs and inventors also yielded similar results. Those who started businesses and contributed patent applications had more hobbies like painting, architecture, sculpture, and literature in their free time than their colleagues. The interest in art among brilliant entrepreneurs, inventors, and scientists clearly reflects their curiosity and capacity. People who are open-minded about science and business also tend to be drawn to ideas and emotions expressed through images, sounds, and words. But not only a certain type of unique individual can be exposed to art. Art also serves as a source of deep inner creative and unique energy for various audiences. When Galileo published his astonishing discoveries about the moon's mountain ranges, his telescope was not truly powerful enough to support that finding. Instead, he recognized zigzag lines dividing the bright and dark regions of the moon. Other astronomers also observed through similar telescopes, but only Galileo had the ability to appreciate the significance of the dark and bright regions. Simonton said, he had the necessary experience in physics and astronomy and also experience in painting. By learning a painting technique called chiaroscuro, the coordination of light and dark colors, focusing on expressing light and shadow, Galileo discovered the mountain ranges while others did not. Just like scientists, entrepreneurs and inventors often discover new ideas by expanding their knowledge of art-related fields, so we can also gain liberality through our cultural and artistic abilities. Research on highly creative adults shows that they tend to move to new cities more often than their peers did in childhood, which exposed them to different cultures and values, encouraging flexibility and adaptability. In a recent study, a team of researchers led by strategy professor Frederick Goddard found that a person's creativity can be influenced by the time they spend abroad. These researchers focused on the fashion industry, tracking buyer and critic evaluations of the creativity of collections from hundreds of companies and fashion designers across seasons in the 21st century. The researchers also studied the biographies of creative directors, tracking the international experiences of fashion icons like Giorgio Armani, Donna Karan, Karl Lagerfeld, Donatella Versace, and Vera Wang. Most of the most creative fashion collections came from brands whose directors had the most experience living abroad. However, there were three main trends. First, it wasn't the time living abroad that mattered, but the time working abroad, actively participating in design abroad. The most unique collections came from directors who had worked in 2 or 3 different countries. Second, the more different the foreign culture was from their homeland, the richer the director's creativity. An American gained very little originality working in Canada compared to participating in a project in South Korea or Japan. But working in multiple countries with different cultures was still not enough. The third and most important factor was the length of time working abroad. If they only stayed abroad for a short period, directors wouldn't have enough time to absorb new ideas from the foreign culture and synthesize them with their own cultural perspective. The greatest originality only emerged when directors had about 3 to 5 years of work abroad. Rick Ludwin's experience fits this model. He had deep experience working with sketches of various comedies for over a decade. He had broad experience living in similar television environments in several different foreign countries, with diverse and specialized shows like daytime and late-night talk shows. After becoming fluent in many television languages, he saw promise where others doubted their success. When Seinfeld was approved, Ludwin continued to supervise the show for all other episodes, placing his faith in the insider-outsider writers, just like himself previously. Most of them came on late at night, and before Seinfeld almost none of them had ever made a sitcom. This meant they never had a problem with unusual ideas. The intuition trap when Steve Jobs was wrong. The first time Steve Jobs approached Segway, he declined to join the project. When Dean Kamen offered the opportunity to other potential investors, Jobs coveted it and got it back, but then quickly abandoned it. Jobs invited Kamen to dinner. As a journalist, Steve Cayley shared that Jobs thought the machine was unique and fascinating, not unlike the computer, and he felt he needed to be involved in the project. Steve Jobs famously based his trust on intuition, not systematic analysis. So why was he usually right in his software and hardware decisions, but wrong this time? There were three main factors in Jobs that made him overconfident in his assessment of Segway's potential: his lack of experience in the field he was entering, his arrogance, and his enthusiasm. The first issue was experience. While NBC executives had extensive experience in traditional sitcoms, to appreciate an unconventional breakthrough like Seinfeld Segway's early investors faced the exact opposite problem. They didn't understand transportation issues. Jobs specialized in digital technology. Jeff Bezos was the king of online retail. And John Doerr had invested in software and internet companies like Sun Microsystems, Netscape, Amazon, and Google. All of them demonstrated originality in their respective fields of expertise, but being a creator in one specific field doesn't mean you'll be a brilliant forecaster in others. To accurately predict the success of a new idea, it's best to be a creator in the field you specialize in. New research led by Eric Dane has shown us why. Intuition is only accurate in areas where we have a lot of experience. In one experiment, people observed 10 designer handbags and judged whether they were real or fake. Half of the participants had only 5 seconds to make their predictions, forcing them to rely on intuition. The other half had 30 seconds. This allowed them to examine and analyze the handbag's features. Dane's team also rated the bags based on their handbag experience. Some in the group had extensive experience, owning more than 3 handbags from famous brands like Coach or Louis Vuitton. Others had never touched any designer bag. If you proudly own a few designer handbags, the less time you have to examine them, the higher your accuracy. Experienced handbag owners were 22% more accurate when they had only 5 seconds to judge than when they had 30 seconds. When you've spent years studying handbags, your intuition can beat analysis because your unconscious mind excels at pattern recognition. If you stop and take time to think, you'll easily get bogged down in seeing the trees but not the forest, meaning you only see the details but not the big picture. However, without handbag knowledge, intuition won't help you. When working with unfamiliar products, you'll need to step back and evaluate them. Non-experts make more rational assessments when conducting thorough analysis. When Steve Jobs had a hunch that the Segway would change the world, he was captivated by the impulsive appeal of novelty without carefully examining its usefulness. Teresa Amabile, a Harvard University psychologist and one of the world's leading academic authorities on creativity, reminds us that to succeed with originality, creations need to be novel, but they also need to be useful. In a digital world dominated by invisible bits and bytes, Jobs was fascinated by the possibility that the next breakthrough innovation would be in transportation. Segway was an engineering marvel, giving people a strange sensation, said Bill Salmon, a Harvard Business School professor who introduced Kamen to Doerr. It was like a magic carpet that could transform into a product, but that product didn't create value. The customers created the value. For a group of people with no experience in transportation, there was a lot of work to be done to predict whether the Segway was truly practical. One of the few investors who actually had concerns in this area was Aileen Lee, who later became an associate partner with Doerr at Kleiner Perkins. In board meetings, Lee questioned, "How will Segway be used? How will you lock it? Where will you store it?" She also had another practical concern: the price, because $5,000 or $8,000 was too expensive for an average person. Looking back, she shared, "I should have stood up and said, we haven't properly assessed this product." Another early skeptic was Randy Commissar, a former entrepreneur, senior counsel at Apple, CEO of Lucas Arts Entertainment, and founding board member at TiVo. He recalled, "I thought about it as if I were sitting with entrepreneurs. I didn't think I was smarter than those guys, but I noticed something different than they did. I thought they saw amazing technology in an incredibly novel application. When we rode the vehicle that day, it was a magical experience on a two-wheeled, self-balancing, maneuverable device. My first impression was that it was a thrilling experience. Now, for some reason, I'm not convinced by it anymore. When Commissar thoroughly researched the market, he realized the Segway couldn't replace cars, but would be an alternative to walking or bicycles. He didn't see it as a typical consumer product. He explained, if you change your mode of transport to use this vehicle, it will cost a high amount and have limitations, especially for pedestrians, even if it's allowed on sidewalks. However, this issue is still being debated, and even at an affordable price, it will take many years for people to trust this product. Instead, he suggested focusing on the device's utility in golf courses, postal services, police departments, or Disney parks. You can see the balance of value and cost in those applications. This is probably their advantage. But Commissar remained reserved. I still see them as a major behavioral change in transportation with significant cost. I don't clearly see how this product will improve the productivity of mail carriers or be the target of postal services under pressure from a series of union labor agreements. On golf courses, people use golf carts to get around all day. So why would they use this alternative product? Meanwhile, Jobs was stuck on his intuition about the novelty. If enough people see this machine, you won't need to convince people to re-engineer cities with it. People are smart, that re-engineering will happen. Nobel laureate psychologist Daniel Kahneman and expert Gary Klein explain that intuition is only reliable when experienced individuals base their judgments in a predictable environment. If you are a doctor facing a patient's symptoms or a firefighter rushing into a burning building, experience will make your intuition more accurate. A strong and stable connection exists between the patterns you've seen before and what you see now. But if you are a stockbroker or a political forecaster, past events do not provide reliable predictions for the present. Kahneman and Klein reviewed evidence showing that experience helps physicists, accountants, insurance analysts, and chess grandmasters fields with relatively consistent cause-and-effect relationships. But admissions officers, court judges, intelligence analysts, psychiatrists, and stockbrokers don't benefit as much from experience in a rapidly changing world. Hard-won lessons can easily lead us astray. On the other hand, due to the accelerating pace of change, our environment is becoming increasingly unpredictable. This makes intuition an unreliable inner voice for new ideas and places ever higher demands on scientific analysis. If we assume Jobs didn't accumulate enough relevant experience in the transportation field, why was he so confident in his intuition? This hypothesis leads us to the second factor. Success often comes with arrogance. When Steve Jobs pushed back on his concerns, he said, "You just don't realize it." Research in transportation and aviation made Commissar realize the problem. The more successful people are in the past, the worse they perform when entering a new environment. They become overconfident and less likely to seek crucial feedback, even in a completely different context. Jobs was one of those who fell into this trap. With a track record and history proving his detractors wrong, he didn't bother to test his intuition by gathering comprehensive opinions from experienced innovators in this new field. And it was intuition that continued to lead him astray when faced with Dean Kamen's presentation style. The perils of passion. When presenting the Segway, Kamen passionately spoke about how developing countries like China and India build several New York-sized cities each year. Urban centers are becoming congested with traffic, posing a severe threat to the environment, and the Segway would help solve this problem. Aileen Lee recalled, "He was a powerful personality, an expert, experienced, and passionate when it came to this issue. He left us all stunned by the idea." In a study conducted by business professor Sherry Minton at Northeastern University, over 6 angel investors made more than 3,500 evaluations of entrepreneurial pitches to decide whether to fund them. Investors filled out a survey rating whether their comments were more intuitive or analytical, evaluating the passion and enthusiasm of each entrepreneur, and finally assessing the funding potential of each startup. The results showed that the more intuitive the investors, the more they gambled on the passion entrepreneurs infused into their products. As Daniel Kahneman explains in Asterisk Thinking, fast and slow asterisk. Intuition operates quickly, based on enthusiastic emotions, while reason is a slower and calmer process. Intuitive investors are easily drawn into the entrepreneur's enthusiasm. Rational investors tend to focus on facts, making calmer assessments of a business's viability. Jobs' intuitive evaluation style made him susceptible to Cayman's passion and the inherent novelty of the technology field. His arrogance and inexperience in transportation made Jobs readily believe things that were actually false positives. When evaluating the prospects of a new idea, we are often easily swayed by the enthusiasm of those who create it. According to Google CEO Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg, truly passionate people don't wear passion on their sleeves, they hold it in their passionate hearts. The passion to see an idea come to fruition isn't manifested in the emotions people express. The enthusiasm we convey through our words, tone, and body language isn't a clue to our intrinsic passion. It merely reflects our presentation skills and personality. For example, research shows that extroverts tend to be more expressive than introverts, meaning they show more passion. But whether we are more extroverted or introverted, fundamentally, that doesn't tell us if we'll be successful as entrepreneurs. You can love an idea and be determined to make it succeed, but still communicate it reservedly. However, this doesn't mean passion is unrelated to business success. A lot of evidence shows that entrepreneurs with intense passion often grow their businesses faster and more successfully. For his part, Cayman lacked the element of passion to help develop ideas from initiatives into impactful products. Instead of being consumed by the passion for creation, early investors should have evaluated his passion for building a company and bringing successful products to market. And to do that, they shouldn't just have paid attention to what he said, but also to what he did. After researching Cayman's past, Randy Commissar concluded that he was a more impressive inventor than an entrepreneur. In the past, Cayman's most successful inventions were products that solved customer problems. In the 1970s, he conceived the idea of a portable infusion pump when his brother, also a doctor, complained that nurses had to constantly administer infusions on site when they should be automatic, and many patients crowded hospitals when they could receive medication at home. In the 1980s, Cayman developed a portable kidney dialysis machine after Baxter Healthcare hired his company to dialyze diabetic patients. He excelled at creating excellent solutions to other people's problems, not at finding the right problems to solve. With the Segway, he started with a solution and then went hunting for a problem. Instead of responding to market demand, he mistakenly started with a technology-driven impulse. Although Cayman had a passion for the Segway, he wasn't sufficiently prepared to make it successful. If we want to improve our idea selection skills, we shouldn't ask if the person will be successful. We need to track how they have been successful. Aileen Lee said, "Looking at Cayman, we saw in him the image of a trustworthy founder with a history of successful medical device inventions, and the people he had worked with were still with him. But when it came to realizing the product, when consistent execution and calculating production costs were crucial, he lacked that experience." Bill Salmon added, "Success is not in the idea, but in the execution of those ideas." If we want to predict whether original people will successfully execute a new idea, we need to look beyond their enthusiasm when presenting the idea and focus on their enthusiasm for execution. This is expressed through action. Rick Ludwin didn't bet on Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David because they initially seemed passionate when presenting their script or even genuinely excited about the show's idea. He gave them another chance because he wanted to see if they would refine the idea and their ability to execute it correctly. They'd be in the writer's room trying to put together the second act at midnight. You could see how meticulous Jerry was in his work. If that's the case, then that's the passion you're looking for. The corrective lens in idea selection. My personal failure with Warby Parker was due to a false negative. After reading research on idea selection, I realized one of my limitations. I was neither a creator in that field nor a customer. Initially, I defended my poor creative forecasting by citing my 20/20 vision. If you've never worn glasses, you'll have difficulty evaluating the preferences of people who do. But reflecting further, I realized what I truly lacked was breadth of experience. I had spent 2 years researching and consulting for an eye care company whose primary revenue came from selling glasses in stores. After optometrists provided prescriptions and customers came to try on glasses, I got stuck in the default mindset of traditional buying and selling. If I had spent time generating ideas before listening to others' pitches, or thoroughly researching how clothing and accessories were sold online, I might have been more open to the ideas. The four founders were not hindered by such blindness. They had both sufficient depth and breadth of experience. Three of them wore glasses and had experience in biotechnology, healthcare, consulting, and banking. One of them, Dave, lost his glasses while traveling abroad for several months without a phone. Upon returning to the US, the simultaneous need to buy a phone and glasses gave him a fresh perspective. Neil Blumenthal didn't wear glasses, but he had spent 5 years working at a nonprofit organization that trained women to start businesses in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The product used in teaching entrepreneurship was glasses. This gave him deep knowledge of the optics industry. He knew that glasses could be manufactured, designed, and sold at lower prices. And having spent time learning about conventional eyewear channels, he had enough broad experience to adopt a new approach. Neil told me, originality rarely comes from insiders, especially when they are entrenched and comfortable with what the optical industry is doing. Thanks to their diverse experiences, the Warby Parker entrepreneurs were not constrained by existing prototypes or limited by an evaluative mindset. Instead of assuming their idea would work and immediately jumping into an enthusiastic sales model, as Cayman had done from the start, they sought extensive feedback from fellow creators and potential customers. By cutting out retail intermediaries, they could sell a pair of glasses that cost $500 for $45. After an expert warned them that costs would increase and that a $500 price was seen as a sign of quality, they conducted a survey with fake product pages, randomly assigning different prices to customers. They found that purchase intent increased up to a price of about $100, then plateaued and decreased at higher prices. They tested different website designs with friends to see what generated not just clicks, but strong trust. Since other companies could sell glasses online, the founders realized that building a brand was crucial to their success. To name the company, they spent 6 months brainstorming ideas, creating a spreadsheet with over 2,000 potential names. They surveyed preferred names in customer surveys and focus groups and found the inspiring name Warby Parker sounded sophisticated and unique, evoking no negative associations. Then, they proceeded to act on their passion. Much of Warby Parker's recent success comes from how they collaborated with colleagues in evaluating ideas. In 2014, they created a program called Warbles, inviting everyone in the company to submit proposals and requests for new technology features at any time. Before Warbles was introduced, they received 10 to 20 idea proposals per quarter. With the new program, this number increased to nearly 400, as employees believed the idea selection process was a talent selection system. Among these, one proposal suggested the company needed to adjust its retail management methods. Another requested a new appointment scheduling system. Warby Parker's head of technology, Labindra, said, "Neil and Dave are truly amazing, but there's no way they can be as amazing as 200 people combined." Instead of limiting idea contributions and letting managers decide which ideas were worth pursuing, Warby Parker kept proposals open and completely transparent in a Google Doc. Everyone in the company could read, comment online, and discuss them in a bi-weekly meeting. This meant, as Justin Berg advises, ideas were not only evaluated by managers, but also by creators, who tend to be more open to entirely new ideas. The time employees spent generating ideas helped them better recognize valuable proposals from colleagues. The technology team had full discretion to filter proposals and implement those that appealed to them. This sounds democratic, but there's a bias here to help employees recognize which proposals are strategic for the company. Managers would vote yes on good proposals and no on bad ones. To avoid false positives and false negatives, votes were not binding. The technology team could overrule managers by choosing a proposal that didn't receive many votes and working to prove its value. Applied psychologist Reb Rebel, who conducted a study at Warby Parker, said, "They didn't wait for permission to start building something. They gathered feedback from colleagues before bringing the product to customers. They started fast and then slowed down. If Segway had gone through a process like Warbles, they might have received a lot of critical feedback that would have helped the manufacturer create a more useful design before it was too late. Dean Kamen should have learned how to create a more practical product or licensed his technology to someone more capable. Despite Segway's failure, Kamen remains a brilliant inventor. Jeff Bezos is still a visionary entrepreneur, and John Doerr is still a wise investor. Whether you are generating or evaluating new ideas, the best thing you can do is measure success on the scale that athletes use in baseball. As Randy Commissar puts it, if my batting average is over .300 in a season, I'm a genius. The future is unpredictable. The sooner you know this, the better you will become. Dean Kamen has since moved on to announce a series of new inventions in healthcare, where he made his initial marks. A prosthetic arm with advanced robotic technology allows amputees to hold a grape or operate a power drill, named Luke after a scene in Star Wars where Skywalker receives a bionic arm. There's a quiet, fuel-efficient machine that can generate electricity and boil water. That's the Slingshot water purifier, which can distill drinking water from any source, requires no filters, and can use fuel made from cow dung. Kamen went back to basics when he pitched the Slingshot to Commissar. But once again, Commissar, a skeptic who had once backpacked through developing countries, thought the machine was too complex to install in areas that needed simplicity. When the machine stops working, it will become a pile of junk. Whether Commissar's prediction is right or wrong, we still see the negative aspects of Kamen's invention. As an inventor, it's best for Kamen to continue blindly generating new ideas and gathering more feedback from fellow creators to sharpen his vision of which ideas might prove useful. As an investor, you might see things more clearly, but you need to play the odds. Instead of relying on a single unique idea, you should wisely place your trust in all of Kamen's creations. In 2003 alone, the United States had over 300,000 new patents. The chance for any of these inventions to change the world is very small. Individual creators have good prospects throughout the idea's life cycle. When evaluating someone's great creativity, we don't focus on their average, but on their peaks. Part 3. Taking risks, protecting truth against power. In the early 1990s, an ambitious CIA analyst, Carmen Medina, was sent to Western Europe for a 3-year assignment. Upon returning to the United States, she realized that leaving the country had helped her rebuild her career. After taking a job that didn't align with her skills and aspirations, she found another way to contribute to the community. She began participating in groups working on the future of intelligence. Throughout her career at the CIA, Medina recognized a fundamental communication problem within the intelligence community. The default information sharing system, through finished intelligence reports, was released once a day and was difficult to coordinate between intelligence agencies. Analysts had no way to share critical insights in a timely manner as they emerged through reports. Because information evolved constantly, it took a long time for crucial information to reach the right people. To ensure peace of mind and national security, every moment became critical. Each intelligence agency needed to create its own daily bulletin as efficiently as possible. And Medina saw the need for a significantly different system that allowed for instant updates of intelligence and immediate sharing between units. To break down negative interdepartmental barriers and accelerate communication, she made a profoundly countercultural proposal. Instead of printing reports on paper, intelligence agencies should update their findings instantly and disseminate them on Intelink, an internal classified network shared between intelligence agencies. Medina's colleagues quickly and bluntly rejected her proposal. No plan like Medina's had ever been tested before. Their argument was that the internet was a threat to national security. Intelligence was a secret operation aimed at good. With the existing system, they ensured printed documents reached the designated recipients. Electronic communication, on the other hand, seemed inherently insecure. If information fell into the wrong hands, we all would be in danger. Medina refused to back down. If the ultimate purpose of these agencies was a better future, and she couldn't defend the truth to them, where else could she do it? Witnessing the fax machine's ability to share information more efficiently, she was convinced that the digital revolution would eventually shake up the intelligence world. She continued to advocate for an internet platform that allowed the CIA to transmit intelligence back and forth with other agencies like the FBI and NSA. Medina adamantly expressed her opinion, but no one listened to her. A senior colleague warned her, "Be careful what you're saying to these groups. If you're too honest and say what you're really thinking, it will ruin your career." Not long after, even her good friends began to distance themselves from her. Finally, utterly frustrated by the disrespect she received, Medina began to lose her temper and shouted so much that she became ill for 3 days and then started looking for a new job. When she couldn't find work outside, she left her position where she had been unable to take action. It was nothing more than a job in the intelligence agency. She remained silent for a while, but 3 years later, she decided to speak up again in support of an online system for continuous and instantaneous reporting between U.S. intelligence agency offices. Less than a decade later, Carmen Medina played an indispensable role in creating a platform called Intellipedia, an internal Wikipedia that allowed intelligence agencies to access each other's data systems. This was completely at odds with CIA standards, to the point that one observer remarked, "It was like asking for vegetarianism to be popularized in Texas." By 2008, Intellipedia had become a critical data resource used by intelligence agencies for immense challenges like protecting the Beijing Olympic Games and identifying the terrorists behind the Mumbai attacks. Within a few years, the website boasted over 500,000 subscribers in the intelligence community, over 1 million pages, and 630 million views, and was awarded the National Security Meritorious Service Medal. A senior leader said, "It's hard to overstate what they accomplished. They made a huge change almost overnight for free, while other programs failed to achieve these results with millions of dollars in funding." So what caused Medina to fail in her first attempt to present her idea, and what helped her be heard the second time? In that time, the world had changed. The internet was widely accepted, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks sounded an alarm, prompting intelligence agencies to think about better cooperation. But they had no online solution until Medina became the CIA's deputy director, which gave her the authority to revive Intellipedia. To reach that position, she had to learn to communicate differently, speak up, and gain people's trust instead of losing it. On one hand, we all hesitate to express a minority opinion, oppose a policy that makes no sense, advocate for a new way of working, or stand up for a disadvantaged community. This chapter will explain when we need to express our views and how to speak up effectively without risking our careers and relationships. What is the best time to speak up, and what steps do we need to take for our opinions to be heard? Along with deciphering Carmen Medina's discoveries, you will learn from an entrepreneur who persuaded investors to fund his company and from a manager who took on Steve Jobs' role. You will find out why the most supportive managers sometimes provide the least support, how gender and race influence their voices, and why the photos we like are the opposite of what our friends love. The purpose is to explain how we can all minimize the risks of speaking up on any issue and achieve the potential benefits of doing so. Power without status asterisk. Leaders and managers appreciate employees who proactively take initiative, build networks, gather new knowledge, and seek feedback. However, some initiatives are punished, voicing concerns to superiors. In a study across manufacturing, services, retail, and nonprofit organizations, the more frequently employees raised ideas and concerns to their superiors, the less likely they were to receive raises and promotions over a 2-year period. In one experiment, when individuals spoke out against racism, they were criticized by those who saw it as wrong but dared not speak up. The higher we climb the moral ladder, the more alone we become. To understand the barriers Carmen Medina faced, we need to separate two fundamental aspects of social hierarchy that often go hand in hand: power and status. Power relates to controlling or ordering others. Status is about being respected and admired. In an experiment led by Professor Alison Fragile at the University of North Carolina, people were punished for trying to exercise power without status. When people tried to influence others but lacked respect from them, they were perceived as disagreeable, coercive, and self-serving. Because they didn't earn our admiration, they had no right to tell us what to do, and we resisted them. This is precisely what happened to Carmen Medina. Her years abroad diminished her standing. She didn't have the opportunity to prove her worth to colleagues, so they placed no trust in her ideas. When people dismissed her concerns, she felt utterly frustrated. When we try to influence others and realize they don't respect us, it creates a vicious cycle of continuous resentment. In an attempt to assert our power, we respond by resorting to increasingly disrespectful behaviors. The most shocking manifestations of this cycle occurred when researchers asked people to work in pairs and instructed the person given power to force the other to perform certain tasks to win a $50 bonus. When those randomly assigned power knew their colleagues admired and respected them, most chose reasonable tasks to earn the $50 bonus. Their colleagues would have to tell a joke or write about their experiences from the previous day. Conversely, if the powerful person knew their colleagues despised them, they would retaliate by making a deliberately humiliating request. For example, telling a colleague to bark like a dog 3 times and say, "I'm dirty," 5 times, or count backward from 500 by sevens. Simply feeling disrespected, the powerful person almost doubled their chances of humiliating others. Carmen Medina didn't go that far, but as she continued to speak up, her attempts to exercise power without status generated increasingly negative reactions. Status cannot be demanded or requested. It must be earned or acknowledged. In her second attempt years later, Medina did not stake her career by trying to reform the system from a subordinate position. Instead, she aimed to consolidate her status by becoming part of the system to change it from within. As iconic filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola observed, the way to approach power isn't always simply to challenge the ruling class, but first to establish yourself, then confront and persuade them. When Medina made the risky choice to present her idea again, she tried to limit the risk she would face by applying for a job in information security. Her primary role was to ensure database systems were secure. She recalled, "That was normal. I never did that." This was truly very conservative. Ensuring the information security of our reports didn't thrill me, but I finally found a gentler way to make what I wanted a reality. Getting to the bottom of responsibility meant exploring digital information transmission options for things we always tried to keep secure. I was always that conservative. It was a balanced risk portfolio. Previously, her case for sharing information over the internet was seen as a security threat. But now she could frame it as part of her mission to protect data security. People saw me there representing something, not opposing the status quo. I thought if I proved myself in that position, it would be an opportunity to start planting the seeds for even bigger changes. As Medina gained respect for her efforts, she accumulated what psychologist Edwin Hollander called idiosyncrasy credits, the leeway to deviate from group expectations. Idiosyncrasy credits are earned from respect, not rank or social status. They are based on contributions to the organization. We suppress low-status individuals when they try to challenge the status quo, but tolerate and even celebrate the eccentricity of high-status stars. In a recent experiment by Silvia Bellezza, people rated male professors at top universities 14% higher in status and authority when wearing t-shirts and beards compared to professors wearing ties and clean-shaven. Most professors dress formally and refuse to conform to norms that are too costly. These individuals successfully gained credibility through subtle signals of their personal style. After Carmen Medina took the security job, she spent the next several years making significant advancements in the digital realm. By working to promote the CIA's mission, she built idiosyncrasy credits to advocate for her vision of knowledge sharing, leading to her promotion to an executive position. In 2005, Zan Denali and Don Berg, 2 CIA analysts from different agency departments, joined forces to create Intellipedia, a Wikipedia for the intelligence community. Many managers were skeptical of the value of a wiki for cross-agency information sharing. Denali admitted, "Trying to implement these tools in the intelligence community is basically like telling your parents they raised you wrong." They were rejected at every stage until they met Carmen Medina, who had quietly built a network of dissidents within the CIA. She supported them with the senior leadership needed for their nascent efforts, ensuring space for them to introduce open-source concepts to a culture built on secrecy. Since Medina held power, she no longer had to worry about how to voice her ideas. But on her path to reaching the position that gave her power, she had to change how she spoke up. Her shift in strategy also has something in common with the most unusual startup pitch you've never seen before. Present your limitations first, the Sarich effect. After welcoming their first child, Rufus Griscom and Alissa Volkman were horrified by the amount of misleading advertising and bad advice offered about parenting. So they started an online magazine and blog network called Babbel to challenge the trite advice that swayed parents and address truly difficult problems with humor. In 2009, when Griscom presented Babbel to venture capitalists, he went against what entrepreneurs were doing. He presented a list of the top 5 reasons why investors should not fund his business. That would likely put an end to his current work. Investors were looking for reasons to say yes, and here he was providing a list of reasons to say no. Entrepreneurs have a duty to highlight their company's strengths, not its weaknesses, but his unconventional approach worked. That year, Babbel raised $3.3 million in funding. 2 years later, Griscom made a trade visit to Disney to see if Disney was interested in acquiring Babbel. In this pitch, he couldn't highlight weaknesses to achieve his goal, because that would admit your startup was having problems, even if you promised to fix those mistakes. But when you're trying to sell an established company, you have every motivation to emphasize that every difficult period leads to brighter days. Strangely, however, Griscom did it again. On one of his presentation slides, he wrote, "Here's why you shouldn't buy Babbel." When presenting his work to Disney's digital division, he explained that user engagement was less than 3 page views per visit, lower than expected. Babbel was supposed to be a parent website, but 40% of its articles were about celebrities, and the failure was once again a wake-up call to redesign their website. Disney ended up acquiring Babbel for $40 million. This is called the Sarich effect, named after social scientist Leslie Sarich. In both situations, Griscom presented ideas to people with more power than him and tried to persuade them to invest. Most of us assume that to be persuasive, we must emphasize our strengths and minimize our weaknesses. This kind of forceful communication would make sense if we had the audience's support. But when you are expressing a novel idea or advocating for a suggested change, the listeners are usually skeptical. Investors will look for flaws in your argument. Managers will hunt for reasons why your proposal won't work. In these cases, there are at least 4 reasons why this form of powerless communication, Griscom's approach, is effective. The first advantage is that presenting weaknesses up front can disarm the audience's skepticism. Marketing professors Marion Friested and Peter Wright found that when we perceive someone trying to persuade us, we naturally raise our mental shields. The persuader's overconfidence is a red flag, a necessary signal to help us guard against an influence attack. In the early days, when Griscom presented Babbel at the first 2 board meetings, he talked about things that were going right for a business, hoping to excite the board about the company's momentum and potential. "Every time I tried to highlight superficial aspects, I was met with skepticism," he recalled. Uncontrolled optimism is like salesmanship. It somehow seems dishonest, and as a result, I was met with skepticism. Everyone is allergic to that feeling or being suspected of being involved in a sale. In the third pitch, Griscom reversed his approach. He candidly discussed all the company's mistakes and the things that kept him up at night. While this tactic might be familiar in a debate, it was highly unusual for an entrepreneur, and the board members reacted more positively than in previous meetings. It shifted their attention from a defensive stance to problem solving. Griscom decided to try similar methods with investors and found similar reactions. They were no longer on guard. When I showed the slide that said, "Here are the reasons why you shouldn't acquire this company," the initial reaction was laughter. Then you could see them relax. That was the sincerity. They couldn't smell, feel, or see anything like a sale anymore. It wasn't a trivial sale. In her initial attempts to speak up, Carmen Medina failed by not acknowledging the limitations of her idea. She stated it as a truth, that the intelligence community needed to share information more openly, making a risky argument that only emphasized the benefits of transparency. A friend confided, "Carmen, you talk as if you won't be happy until everyone accepts these things as truth." In her second attempt to present her views, years later, she found a more balanced approach in her presentations, expressing a bit of doubt by saying, "Perhaps I am wrong." After Medina was promoted to a leadership position, she saw herself in debates. If people only presented the advantages of ideas and quickly concluded that the idea had too many flaws, they hadn't truly thought it through. They tried to sanitize their presentation slides to prevent me from seeing the flaws. When people presented limitations or disadvantages, I immediately became an ally. Instead of selling me an idea, they presented me with a problem they needed my help to solve. Along with changing the system of interaction, frankly acknowledging mistakes changes user perception. In a rather interesting experiment, Teresa Amabile asked people to rate the intelligence and expertise of readers who shared their book reviews. She wondered if adjusting the tone of the review would change readers' perceptions of the critics. She took book reviews published in the New York Times and edited them so their content was quite similar, only the tone was either laudatory or scathing. Half of the participants were randomly assigned to read a positive review. Across 128 pages of inspiring prose, Alvin Harder's debut novel demonstrates a truly competent young American author. A Longer Dawn is a short novel or a prose poem, depending on your aesthetic, with great impact. It touches on very basic things: life, love, death, and everything unfolds rapidly, taking Alvin's pen to new heights on every page. Another version was more critical, where Amabile kept the language intact but replaced some adjectives with disparaging ones instead of praise. Across 128 tedious pages of his debut novel, Alvin Harder demonstrates nothing more than a truly incompetent young American author. A Longer Dawn is a prose poem, if you want to call it that, with no significant impact. It touches on basic things: life, love, death, but at such a superficial level that it only reaches the depth of an ordinary pen on every page. In these two versions, which one was rated higher by readers? They had to be fair. The quality of the work, in the eyes of the reviewer, was unchanged. The vocabulary was comparable, and so was the grammatical structure. The same skill was needed to write both versions. But people rated the critics of the critical version as 14% more intelligent and having 16% better literary judgment than those who gave positive reviews. We assume an amateur can appreciate art, but to criticize a work requires a professional level. Just changing a few words from inspiring to tedious, from competent to incompetent, from great impact to no significant impact, from unfolds rapidly to superficial level, and from new heights to depth of an ordinary pen, was enough for the critical reviewers to be perceived as more intelligent. Amabile wrote, "Pessimistic prophets appear wise and insightful, while those who offer positive words are seen as naive Pollyannas." This is the second benefit of leading with the limitations of an idea. It makes you look smart. Rufus Griscom discovered this early in his career, which originated in publishing. "There's nothing more embarrassing than writing an entirely positive review," he remarked. Even if reviewers loved the book, they felt obliged to write an additional paragraph at the end to make it complete. According to Griscom's philosophy, I am not a block of wood. I am not completely frozen by this author. I have my own perceptions. When he presented Babel's problems to investors, he demonstrated that he wasn't frozen by his own ideas or trying to freeze them. He was a sharp judge of his own shortcomings. He was smart enough to address the missing pieces and anticipate the problems investors might see. The third benefit of directly confronting the drawbacks of your ideas is that it makes you more trustworthy. When Rufus Griscom described the obstacles he faced in his business, he showed not only knowledge, but also honesty and humility. Of course, the most obvious weaknesses can backfire if the audience doesn't recognize them. It can be ammunition for them to shoot down your idea. But Griscom's audience was skeptical and wanted to understand the problems throughout the due diligence process. Investors' job is to find the company's flaws. By telling them the shortcomings of my business model, I built trust with them, Griscom explained. And being frank about the business's weaknesses made him more trustworthy than if he had only talked about the strengths. You need confidence to be humble, to face your weaknesses, Griscom said. If I'm willing to tell investors the flaws in my business, they'll think it's awful if that's true. Disney trusted Griscom so much that after acquiring Babel, they put him on their board to develop business projects for 2 years as vice president and general manager, where he played a key role in developing Disney Interactive's digital strategy. The Sarich effect returned. The fourth advantage of this approach is that it makes it easier for the audience to evaluate the idea conveniently. because we can have biases in how we process information. To demonstrate this bias, I often ask executives to rate how happy they are after thinking about the positive aspects of their lives. One group is tasked with writing down 3 good things in their lives. Another group has to list 12 good things. Everyone assumes the group that writes 12 good things will be happier. The more blessings you list, the better you feel about your circumstances. But almost the opposite is true. We are happier when we list only 3 good things instead of 12. Why is that? Psychologist Norbert Schwarz points out that the more we think about something, the more common and important we perceive it to be. There seemed to be one certainty for executives when they listed 3 good things about their lives. They immediately listed their love for their children, spouse, and work. Because these were the wins generating positive things, they thought their lives were quite good. It was difficult to come up with 12 good things about their lives. After family and work, executives often mentioned friends, and when asked, they would name them one by one. After struggling to come up with a dozen good things, they concluded that their lives were not good at all. This is what happened to investors when Rufus Griscom cited Babbel's weaknesses. By admitting his most serious problems, he made it difficult for investors to think of anything else that had gone wrong with his company. And when they no longer perceived any other concerns, they decided that Babbel's problems were not really serious. Griscom noticed this in the first Babbel board meeting when he first tried his approach of presenting his weaknesses. When I cited factors that could kill my company, the board's reaction was completely opposite. Oh, these things aren't too bad. Newton's third law can also apply to human motivation. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But ironically, presenting drawbacks can make it harder for the audience to think and voice their own opinions accurately than seeing advantages. Familiarity breeds liking. Look at the following list of familiar songs. Choose one of them and tap its rhythm on your hand. Happy Birthday, Mary Had a Little Lamb, Jingle Bells, Rock Around the Clock, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Now, how many of your friends do you think will recognize the song you're tapping? I've done this experiment for years with leaders and students. While educational, it's also very amusing at dinner parties. What's your guess? If you say no one will recognize the song you're tapping, you need to reevaluate your tapping skills or seriously doubt your friends' listening abilities. In an initial study at Stanford University, people thought it would be quite easy for listeners to guess the song title after they tapped the rhythm. They predicted their friends would have a 50% chance of accurately naming the song. But when they proceeded to tap the songs, only 2.5% actually guessed the song correctly. Out of 120 tapped songs, people expected 60 to be recognized. But in reality, only 3 were recognized. I've gotten similar results in many other organizations. At a J.P. Morgan Chase senior leadership event, CEO Jamie Dimon predicted that the executive sitting next to him had a 100% chance of guessing correctly. He was right, but almost everywhere, we are overconfident in our predictions. Why is that? Often, we can't tap a song's rhythm without hearing the melody in our heads. This makes it impossible for us to imagine that the rhythm we're tapping sounds like disjointed noises to listeners who aren't hearing the accompanying melody, as Chip and Dan Heath write in their book Made to Stick. Listeners can't hear the melody. What they can hear is a series of disjointed noises, like a strange Morse code. This is the main challenge when communicating a novel idea. When you present a new proposal, you're not just hearing the melody in your mind. You're writing a song. You've spent hours, days, weeks, months, or even years thinking about the idea. You've anticipated problems, built solutions, and refined your vision. You know the lyrics and melody of the idea in your head. By that point, you can no longer imagine what the song will sound like to an audience hearing it for the first time. This explains why we rarely communicate our ideas openly. They are so familiar to us that we underestimate how much exposure audiences need to them to understand and fully believe in them. When Harvard University professor John Cotter studied organizations with transformative ideas years ago, he found that they often reduced their vision communication by a factor of 10. Generally, they talked about their direction of change 10 times less than what stakeholders needed to hear. Over a 3-month period, employees might encounter 2 million words, and on average during that time, the vision for change was expressed in only 13,400 words, which could include a 30-minute speech, a multi-hour meeting, a press conference, and a memo. Since over 99% of the communication employees encountered over those 3 months was unrelated to the new idea, how could they be expected to understand it? Could they automatically absorb the idea? Those who held the transformative idea didn't realize this because they only focused on issues related to their vision. If we want people to accept our original ideas, we need to speak up, then repeat ourselves. To illustrate this, which of the following words do you prefer? Iktitaf or Sarich? If you're like most people, you'll prefer Sarich to Iktitaf, but in reality, the issue isn't in the words themselves. The brilliant psychologist Robert Zajonc called this the mere exposure effect. The more frequently we encounter something, the more we like it. When he first showed people nonsense words like Iktitaf and Sarich, both test words were equally appealing. But when Zajonc presented one of them twice in a comparative test, people grew to like the word presented more, and the preference increased further after 5, 10, and 25 viewings. To increase your preference for the word Sarich, I used it 5 times in previous sections before talking about Rufus Griscom. There is no such thing as the Sarich effect, and there is no social scientist named Leslie Sarich. I made it up to demonstrate the mere exposure effect. Rufus Griscom is a real person, as are the other people named in this book. The mere exposure effect is amplified many times. The more familiar we are with a face, a word, a number, a sound, a smell, a brand, or a Chinese character, the more we like it. This is true across cultures and species. Even chicks prefer familiarity. My favorite preference test is when people look at their own photos and those of their friends, whether normal or reversed. We like our friends' regular photos because that's how we usually see them. But we also prefer to see our own reversed images as we see ourselves in the mirror. Entrepreneur Howard Tallman said, "Familiarity breeds liking, it brings comfort." One explanation for this effect is that frequent exposure makes processing easier. A novel idea requires more effort for us to fully understand it. The more we see it, hear it, and touch it, the more comfortable and connected we become, and the less threatened we feel. Just as film can be damaged by being left too long in the sun, and songs heard too often get stuck in our heads, overly familiar ideas can lead to boredom. Generally, evidence suggests that liking continues to increase with 10 to 20 exposures to an idea, and even more exposures can be helpful for more complex ideas. Interestingly, exposure is more effective when it is still weak and interspersed with other ideas to maintain audience curiosity. It's best to have a delay between presenting ideas and evaluating them, so stakeholders have time to absorb them. If you're making a proposal to your boss, you might start with a brief, to-the-point presentation, only 30 seconds during a Tuesday conversation, repeat it on Wednesday, and then ask for feedback at the end of the week. When Carmen Medina became deputy director of the U.S. Intelligence Agency, she knew that for intelligence analysts to share information more openly, she needed to regularly expose them to her ideas. So she started writing a blog on the internal classified network, trying to model the transparency she advocated for. Twice a week, she wrote short commentaries expressing her views on the need to share information and reduce secrecy, asserting that this would be the wave of the future. Initially, many leaders pondered and dismissed this view. Exposure, attending key presentations interspersed with other forms of communication, and further reflection on the ideas during the delays between them made leaders pay more attention to Medina's ideas. Not long after, CIA technology experts developed an internal platform that allowed employees to set up their own blogs. And this spread. People began to trust her because she emboldened them to start blogs. Thanks in no small part to her efforts, the intelligence community achieved a vision of a vibrant blogosphere where knowledge was formally shared by analysts across different agencies. To quit before you leave. When I first learned Carmen Medina's story, I wondered why she continued to speak up after it had ruined her career. Built on a classic book by economist Albert Hirschman, there are 4 different options for dealing with an unsatisfactory situation. Whether you're unhappy with your job, marriage, or government, decades of research show you can choose between exit, voice, loyalty, and neglect. Exit means removing yourself entirely from something, quitting a miserable job, ending a bad marriage, or leaving an oppressive country. Voice refers to actively trying to improve the situation, approaching your leader with ideas to make work better, encouraging your spouse to seek counseling, or becoming a political activist to elect a less corrupt government. Loyalty means enduring, gritting your teeth. Still working hard, no matter how stifling your job is, staying committed to your partner, or supporting the government even if you disagree with its policies. Neglect means maintaining the status quo, but gradually reducing your efforts, doing just enough to not get fired, pursuing new hobbies to distance yourself from your spouse, or refusing to vote. Fundamentally, these choices are based on feelings of control and commitment. Do you believe you can bring about change, and then do you care enough to try? If you believe you are stuck with the status quo, you will choose neglect and disengagement, still trying to get by. If you feel you can make a difference but are not committed to anyone, any country, or any organization, you will leave. Only when you believe your actions matter and care deeply about the issue will you consider speaking up. After Carmen Medina remained silent in her initial attempt to voice her idea, she no longer believed she could make a difference. She wasn't the type to shirk responsibility, but one of her commitments was broken. I was like a refugee on a boat somewhere between neglect and loyalty. Even years later, she didn't want to relive the feeling of speaking up having destroyed her career. I was very hesitant to go back there. I wasn't sure enough time had passed. She recalled, reflecting on it, "Do you know what made me crazy enough to do it again? Because I was working for Mike, the best boss I had ever collaborated with in my career." In the workplace, our sense of commitment and control depends more on our direct manager than anyone else. When working with a supportive superior, our relationship with the organization strengthens, and we feel more influential. Thinking about this boss who gave Medina the confidence to speak up again, I envisioned a very pleasant, warm, trusting, and cooperative person. So I was surprised when Medina described Mike as skeptical and sharp. The portrait she painted of her boss fit the image of a tougher manager, someone often skeptical and critical of others. Tough managers are often the last people we seek out when we are in a dangerous situation. But sometimes they are our strongest supporters. Many of us love approval and hate conflict, wishing to please others and protect harmony, which makes us fall behind instead of uniting. Because agreeable people always prioritize cooperation and conformity to norms, they are not inclined to create waves of animosity and disrupt interpersonal relationships, wrote management researchers Jeff Lapine and Lynn Van Dyne after studying speaking up. Often, prickly people are those who are more comfortable publicly expressing views against others and against conventions. In a study led by psychologist Stephen Coate, adults filled out a personality survey measuring their tendencies toward agreeableness and disagreeableness. Over the next 3 weeks, 6 times a day, they reported what they did and how they felt. Agreeable people were happiest in moments when they offered praise and compliments, laughed with others, expressed affection, reassured others, compromised, or conceded to please others. Conversely, disagreeable people experience the greatest joy when criticizing, confronting, or challenging others. In decisions to speak up, the people we choose as our audience are as problematic as the way we deliver our message. When we speak to agreeable audiences, their instinct is to nod and smile. In an effort to reconcile and avoid conflict, they often hesitate to provide critical feedback. Disagreeable managers, however, are more likely to lean in to challenge us, helping us improve our ability to articulate more effectively. Many people can be skeptical, as long as it doesn't go too far, Medina noted. I don't think my boss Mike ever fully believed this was the way an organization needed to approach things, but he respected diversity of thought even if he didn't necessarily agree. And we often disagreed on many things, but I felt I could be honest with him, and he would give me enough rope. But he would definitely stop me before I hanged myself. Instead of talking to agreeable audiences, it's better to target your idea pitches to those with a history of originality. Research shows that when managers have a past of challenging the status quo, they tend to be more open to new ideas and feel less threatened by opinions from others. They care more about creating a better organization than protecting their own position. They are motivated by the organization's mission, meaning they won't be so loyal and compliant that they overlook its flaws. Medina said, Mike loved his organization, but he was willing to criticize it. He wept when talking about the mission. He was very tolerant of incongruity, of eccentricity, compared to many other managers in the organization. With the support of a tough boss whose top priority was strengthening the CIA, Medina regained her sense of control and commitment. Knowing that her boss would let her pursue her idea, she was ready to continue her efforts to promote more open information sharing. When promoted at the CIA, Medina found that her colleagues were more receptive to her proposals, even though they were mid-level managers who had previously opposed similar suggestions. Social scientists have long demonstrated the agreeableness effect from these mid-level individuals. If you sit in a senior position, you are expected to be different from them and therefore have the right to go in a different direction. Similarly, if you are still at the bottom of a status hierarchy, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain from your originality. But the middle of the hierarchy, where most of us are, is dominated by insecurity. At that point, you've gained a little respect. You are valuable in your group and don't want your position threatened. To maintain and possibly gain status later, you play the game of following the leader enough to prove your worth as a team member. As sociologist George Hammonds observed, the conservatism of mid-level status groups reflects the anxiety of someone who desires social status but fears being stripped of their authority. A fall from low to even lower is almost painless, but a fall from mid-level to the bottom is devastating. Not long ago, I was asked to interview Google CEO Larry Page on stage. At dinner the night before the event, I asked him why he and Sergey Brin had been so hesitant to drop out of graduate school and commit full-time to Google so early. His answer focused on their career stage. If they presented themselves as academic superstars, they might have dedicated themselves to Google without fear of loss. Earlier in their careers, when they had no status, they were completely willing to take risks. Page kept himself busy at university, working on a solar-powered car and building a printer from Lego pieces. But if they could have made significant progress with their PhD program, they would have had more to lose by giving it up. The influence of mid-level status leads us to choose safety in what has been proven right, rather than accepting the risks of originality. Columbia University sociologist Damon Phillips and MIT's Ezra Zuckerman point out that security analysts were significantly less likely to issue negative stock ratings when they or the banks that hired them were in mid-level positions. Issuing a sell recommendation could upset company executives and investors who valued the stock. Analysts with poor track records at small banks had nothing to fear from failure when taking these risks, and prominent analysts at large banks had a safety net. But for moderately successful analysts at mid-sized banks, those trying to advance themselves an ineffective proposal could be a career limiter. When Carmen Medina was promoted, she learned that speaking up would now have a greater impact on whether an idea moved forward or was shot down, and she spent less time trying to reach mid-level managers. But senior leaders saw her as one of the rare employees who believed something was wrong with the agencies and also believed it could be changed. Her credibility continued to be reinforced by the young colleagues who followed her. When she shared her views with emerging employees at the CIA, they were excited by this vision and respected her greatly. Younger employees appreciated new ideas and saw her as a model of how difficult it is to be heard. Medina's colleague, Susan Benjamin, emphasized, it reinforced her reputation and helped her be heard. When minority women speak up, difficulties double. Speaking to an audience of risk-averse mid-level managers is challenging for anyone, especially for Carmen Medina, a woman in a male-dominated organization. When I first heard her story, I naively assumed that the era when women were disregarded in their careers was long over, and that she would be judged fairly based on the quality of her initiatives, not her gender. But looking back at everything that happened to her, I was dismayed to discover that even today, women who dare to express their opinions still face many obstacles. In many cultures, there is abundant evidence that outdated views on gender roles persist today. They want men to be strong and women to be subservient. When women speak up, they risk being labeled as violating gender stereotypes. This makes those around them perceive them as aggressive. Speaking up is an act of leadership. And as Sheryl Sandberg wrote in Lean and Asterisk, when a woman exhibits leadership, she is often labeled bossy. Analyzing my own data, the results were truly perplexing. In an international bank and a healthcare company, I found that revenue-generating contributions led to higher ratings for men, but not for women. Other studies show that male leaders who speak more than their peers are praised. but female leaders who do so are rated lower by both men and women. Similarly, when women make business improvement suggestions, managers rate them as less loyal than men and less favorable to their proposals. Especially in male-dominated organizations, women pay a price for speaking up. In her first attempt to voice her opinions, Carmen Medina paid that price. The acceptance level for women's behavior at that time was narrower than for men. She said that during her second journey, she had a different experience. Because part of her job was to update information online, she no longer had to worry about being seen as aggressive when clearly expressing her views. In the early 1990s, when everything failed, my passion for this change was mixed with feelings of personal failure when I thought I couldn't advance further in my career. At that time, I was only thinking of myself, Medina said. The entire second chapter of this journey was truly very different from the first chapter. This time, I prioritized the common mission. General research shows that when women speak up on behalf of others, they avoid backlash because they are sacrificing for others. Undoubtedly, the path was difficult for Medina because she was a woman working in a male-led CIA. As a Puerto Rican woman, she was a member of not just one, but two minority groups. Recent research shows that her double minority status may have amplified the gains and losses of speaking up. Management researcher Ashley Rose, an African American, found that she herself was treated differently when she acted more assertively than white women and black men. When working with colleagues, she found that double minority members faced double the risk. When black women failed, they were judged more harshly than black men and white leaders of both genders. They were incompatible with leadership prototypes in both black and female forms, and they suffered unfair blame when they made mistakes. For double minority members, Rose's team showed that failure was not an option. But interestingly, Rose and her colleagues found that when black women gained leadership, they did not face the same risks as white women and black men. With dual identity, black women didn't have to adhere to certain rules at work. Because people didn't know which identity to apply to them, they could be more flexible in behaving as black or as women without fear of breaking stereotypes. But this only happened when they clearly demonstrated their competence. For minority members, gaining status before exercising power is especially important. By quietly implementing her plan to put information online as part of her job, Carmen Medina consolidated success without drawing too much attention. I operated quietly at that time, she said. No one really paid attention to what I was doing, and I kept repeating the process of transforming us into an organization ready to change at any moment. It was very much like a home experiment. I had a lot of freedom. After Medina had accumulated enough preparation, she began to speak up. And this time, people were ready to listen to her. Rose found that when women reached the top, and there were clear indications that they were in control, people had to acknowledge that these women had overcome stereotypes and discrimination, so they must be individuals of extraordinary resilience and talent. But what happens when those voices are not heard? The untraveled road. Donna Dubinsky was not yet 30, and it was the most exciting time of her life. As Apple's director of distribution and sales in 1985, she worked tirelessly from early morning until late at night, frantically focused on shipping computers to meet booming demand. Suddenly, Steve Jobs demanded the closure of all 6 U.S. warehouses. He wanted to reduce inventory and switch to a just-in-time manufacturing method, where computers were assembled to order and shipped quickly overnight by FedEx. Dubinsky believed this was a grave mistake, one that could jeopardize the company's entire future. In my mind, Apple's success depended on the success of its distribution operations, she said. For a while, she ignored the idea, thinking it would disappear. But the idea didn't disappear, and she began to find reasons why it was a mistake. Distribution was going well, she insisted. Her team was about to have a record sales quarter, and complaints were almost non-existent. Even though she was a master in distribution, her objections were overruled by her superiors. Finally, she was assigned the task of spending several months reviewing Jobs' intentions. In the final session with the group, her boss's superior asked if anyone agreed with Jobs' proposed build-to-order production line. Jobs was in power then, and the majority followed him. Dubinsky was in the minority. Should she speak up and challenge the chairman, known for his bold ideas, or should she remain silent to please Jobs? Though Dubinsky was one of the few women in leadership at Apple in the 1980s, I never thought gender was an issue for me. She was deeply committed. She had poured her heart and soul into the company. She held an executive position. She was partly responsible for the distribution department. She decided to take a stand and present her arguments against Jobs' proposal. Knowing she needed more time to solidify her position, she met her boss's superior and issued an ultimatum. If she couldn't present her own argument after 30 days, she would leave Apple. Making such an offer was a risky move, but her request was granted. Dubinsky came up with a new proposal: strengthen customer service centers instead of transitioning distribution to a build-to-order system. That would yield the desired benefits without any risks. Her proposal was accepted. The reason my opinion was heard was because of my performance and the impact I delivered. People saw me as someone who could make changes happen. If you're known as a value creator, you'll be respected. She had earned status before exercising power, so she had special merit to gain the advantage. From an outsider's perspective, the prospect of going against Steve Jobs seemed like a losing battle. But despite his tendency to disagree with her, Jobs was ultimately a reasonable person. Dubinsky knew that Jobs respected those who spoke frankly to his face, and he was open to new courses of action. And she wasn't speaking up for herself, she was fighting for Apple. By daring to challenge an idea she believed was wrong, Dubinsky was promoted, and she wasn't alone. From 1981, the Macintosh team began giving an annual award to those who dared to challenge Jobs, and Jobs promoted the successful ones among them to run larger divisions within Apple. Comparing the experiences of Carmen Medina and Donna Dubinsky raises fundamental questions about the optimal solution to dissatisfaction. In the pursuit of breakthroughs, you cannot ignore what makes you unhappy. Stubbornness is a temporary way to gain a voice. But in the long run, like ignoring problems, stubbornness leads to stagnation and is ineffective in resolving your dissatisfaction. To transform a situation, exit and voice are the only viable alternatives. Years ago, Hirschman warned us of a major limitation of exit. While it has the benefit of helping to transform your own situation, it doesn't make the situation better for anyone else because it leaves things as they were. Voice, then, becomes effective, Hirschman argued, when you have no other option to exit. In recent years, the world has changed in ways that make automatic exit easier. The time when Carmen Medina couldn't find another job after her controversy in 1985 at the CIA is long past. Spending an entire career at a single organization is a thing of the past. Today's dynamic labor market allows many people to find new positions with new employers. Thanks to globalization, social media, and rapid transportation and communication technologies, we have more flexibility than ever before. With these advantages, if you are dissatisfied with your job and can easily switch jobs, what reason do you have to speak up and pay the price? From Hirschman's perspective, exit is detrimental to breakthroughs. But Donna Dubinsky's experience sheds a different light on exit. After winning the distribution battle at Apple, she gained a higher position in global business and marketing at Claris, Apple's software subsidiary. Within a few years, her team generated half of Claris's revenue. In 1991, when Apple refused to let Claris spin off as an independent company, Dubinsky was so disappointed by the lack of opportunity to make an impact that she decided to quit. She flew to Paris and spent a year painting and reflecting on ways to contribute to a larger mission. When she met an entrepreneur named Jeff Hawkins, she decided to become CEO of his startup, Palm Computing, because she believed it would create the next big wave in technology. Under Dubinsky's leadership, the startup developed into the Palm Pilot, achieving resounding success as the first major hit in the nascent personal digital assistant market. Palm Pilot stock was issued in 1996, and within a year and a half, it sold over 1 million units. In 1997, when Palm was acquired by 3Com, Dubinsky disagreed with some strategic decisions. For example, when corporate finance departments wanted all departments to cut their budgets by 10%, Dubinsky spoke out against it. Persuade the company to invest in areas that are succeeding and cut budgets in other areas that are not. In response to her opinion, the company told her she wasn't a good manager. She'd better go back and consult with her department. Deeply frustrated, Dubinsky and Hawkins left Palm to found a new company, Handspring, in 1998. Just 1 year later, Handspring launched its Visor handheld computer, which quickly captured a quarter of the market. After the spectacular growth of the Zaire smartphone, Handspring merged with Palm in 2003. Not long after, Steve Jobs launched the iPhone. Years earlier, Dubinsky recalled sitting in a room with Steve Jobs. Jobs said, "No way will I design a phone." Was he influenced by us because we had created a great phone and he changed his mind? No, he would never admit it. But despite his stubbornness, Jobs succeeded. It was the lack of an exit path that pushed Carmen Medina to advance national security. And it was precisely the opportunity to exit that helped Donna Dubinsky pioneer the smartphone revolution. The lesson here is that speaking your mind isn't always the better way to solve a problem. In some cases, sometimes leaving a restrictive organization can be a better path to originality. The best thing we can do is voice our opinions and ensure a balance of our risks, preparing exit strategies when necessary. If our boss is progressive like Steve Jobs, we might try to stay and speak up. But if not, and the stakeholders lack openness to changing opinions, we might find better opportunities elsewhere. Questions that can help us reflect on what should have happened. If Medina left the CIA, could she have succeeded in voicing her ideas elsewhere? If Dubinsky stayed at Apple, would the company have developed the iPhone or come up with other innovations? We will never have answers to these counterfactual scenarios, but we can learn something from the decisions Medina and Dubinsky made. Although one ultimately chose to speak up and the other to leave, their choices were similar in one way. They chose to speak out, not to remain silent. And in the long run, research shows that the mistakes we regret are not due to errors of commission, but errors of omission. If we can overcome these things, most of us will blame ourselves less and express our ideas more. That's exactly what Carmen Medina and Donna Dubinsky did, and they left themselves with few regrets. Part 4. Foolish enthusiasm. The disadvantages of being on time, of strategic procrastination, and of being a pioneer. It was late at night. In his hotel room, a young friend stared at a blank piece of paper on the table. His anxiety grew. He reached for the phone and sent some ideas to his mentor, who was a few floors below, and who then ran up the stairs directly to his room to discuss the speech that would change history. At 3:00 a.m., the young friend was still frantically working, his bones aching, his body collapsing from exhaustion. It was a night in August 1963. Although the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was planned for the next morning, Martin Luther King Jr. had not yet finished his closing speech. He wrestled with the speech all night, not sleeping a wink. King's wife, Coretta, recalled, he was the last speaker, and his words would be broadcast on television and radio to millions across America and around the world. That speech was incredibly important because it would spread inspiration and clarity to everyone. The march had been announced to the press 2 months prior, and King knew it would be a monumental event. With widespread media coverage, at least hundreds of thousands of people were expected to attend. In addition, King also invited several prominent figures to participate and support the event. These celebrities included civil rights pioneers like Rosa Parks and Jackie Robinson, actors Marlon Brando and Sidney Poitier, and singers Harry Belafonte and Bob Dylan. There was very little time allotted for the closing speech, so naturally, King began drafting it immediately. Since each speaker was only given 5 minutes, he had to be particularly careful in his choice of words. Great thinkers throughout history, from Benjamin Franklin to Henry David Thoreau to Martin Luther King Jr., realized that it takes more time to prepare a short speech than a long one. If it's a 10-minute speech, it will take me 2 weeks to prepare, President Woodrow Wilson said. I can talk as long as I want, as long as you don't ask me to prepare anything beforehand. But King didn't start writing his speech until after 10 p.m. the night before the march. Parents and teachers constantly implore children to start their homework earlier instead of waiting until the last minute. The world of self-help always emphasizes preventing procrastination. But what if procrastination was the reason King created the best speech of his life? In work and life, we are often taught that acting early and quickly is the key to success because procrastinators lose out. When we have a meaningful task, we are advised to complete it before the deadline. When we have a novel idea, such as inventing a new product or starting a business, we are encouraged to be pioneers. Of course, there are clear advantages to speed. We can be sure to finish what we start and beat competitors to market. But surprisingly, as I studied originality, I discovered that the advantages of acting quickly and being a pioneer are overshadowed by many disadvantages. The truth is, early birds catch the worm. But we also shouldn't forget that the worm woke up early too and got caught. This chapter analyzes the question of when we should take original action. When you are preparing to row upstream against the tide, you have choices about whether to start just before dawn, wait until noon, or wait until sunset. My goal here is to dispel common assumptions about timing by evaluating the unexpected benefits of procrastination when we start and finish a task, as well as when we release our ideas into the world. I will discuss why procrastination can be considered a necessary supportive condition, or how first-time entrepreneurs often face an uphill battle, or why older, more experienced innovators sometimes outperform younger ones, and why leaders who are willing to change effectively are those who patiently wait for the right moment to act. Despite the inherent risks of such delays, you will also see that waiting can reduce risk by preventing you from putting all your eggs in one basket. You are not the first to demonstrate originality, and the most successful originality doesn't always follow the schedule. They are always the late, but well-prepared party. Another Da Vinci Code. Recently, a doctoral student with an unusually creative mindset named Jihi Shin came to me with a peculiar idea. Procrastination can be beneficial for originality. When you procrastinate, you are intentionally prolonging the time for the task you need to do. You might think about the task, but you delay taking steps or completing it at a lower productivity rate. Shin proposed that when you set a task, you use your time to consider more divergent thoughts, rather than just seizing a specific idea. As a result, you consider a range of unique ideas and ultimately choose a novel approach. I asked her to test that novel idea. Shin asked college students to write business proposals for a convenience store in a vacant spot on campus. When students started working immediately, they tended to propose conventional ideas for a convenience store, just like other convenience stores. When Shin randomly assigned some participants to procrastinate by distracting them from the assigned task and asking them to play computer games like Minesweeper, Free Cell, and Solitaire, they then generated more novel business ideas, such as adding a tutoring center and a storage facility. Independent raters reviewed the final proposals without knowing who had procrastinated or who had started immediately. The proposals from the procrastinators were rated as 28% more creative. Although we were genuinely excited about these results, we were concerned that procrastination wasn't the actual cause of creativity. Perhaps playing games created mental stimulation, giving people energy to think more creatively, or simply allowing them to rest, escaping work to think freely. But experiments showed that neither playing games nor relaxing stimulated creativity. When students in the experiment played games first, before learning about the task, they didn't submit any more novel proposals. To do that, they needed to actually procrastinate while playing games, but still keep the task of brainstorming business ideas in the back of their minds. When they started working immediately and then took a short break before returning to work, they had more positive changes to restart again. This only happened when they started thinking about the task and then intentionally procrastinated, because they needed to consider multiple future possibilities and generate more creative ideas. The procrastination process helped them spend more time considering different ways to complete the task, rather than narrowing down and freezing on a specific strategy. Are Shin's findings valid in the real world? To find out, she collected data from a Korean furniture company. Employees who regularly procrastinated spent more time thinking in different directions and were rated by their bosses as having significant creative contributions. However, procrastination doesn't always foster creativity. If employees don't actively try to solve a big problem, procrastination only drags things down. But when they are passionate, eager to embrace new ideas, stepping away from work leads them to more creative solutions. Procrastination can be the enemy of productivity, but it can be a resource for creativity. Long before modern humans became obsessed with work efficiency from the Industrial Revolution and the Protestant work ethic, civilizations recognized the benefits of delay. In ancient Egypt, there were two different verbs for procrastination. One referred to intentional laziness, the other to waiting for the right moment. It's no coincidence that some of history's most original thinkers and inventors were procrastinators. A prime example is Leonardo da Vinci, whose unique achievements spanned fields from painting and sculpture to architecture, music, mathematics and engineering, geology and cartography, anatomy and botany. Scholars estimate that da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa in intermittent bursts over many years, then stopped painting it unfinished and did not complete it until his death. Critics argued that he was superficial and wasted his time with optical experiments and other distractions that prevented him from finishing the painting earlier. Yet these distractions turned out to help him discover his crucial unique insights. As historian William E. Wallace explained, for example, Leonardo's studies of how light strikes a sphere helped create the continuous light model of the Mona Lisa and St. John the Baptist. His work in optics may have delayed the project, but his ultimate achievement in painting depended on these optical experiences. Instead of avoiding distractions like many thinkers of his time, his ideas represented an era of genius, an independent work that broke away from the old ideas that his other famous works relied on. If creative procrastination was applied selectively and prevented Leonardo from completing some less important tasks so that his work could integrate with core harmonious values before completion, only those mediocre individuals who worship the school of efficient production could criticize him for that delay. The school of efficient production usually requires clear, conventional working principles. It will not be changed by anything. But a genius cannot be controlled, and nothing can control them. You cannot schedule or outline the work for a genius. Da Vinci spent about 15 years developing ideas for the painting The Last Supper while working on a series of other projects. The painting was initially sketched with figures sitting on a long bench. Decades later, it became the foundation for a new horizontal arrangement with 13 seats at the table in that famous painting. Although he often expressed frustration with his procrastination, Da Vinci realized that what is unique cannot be rushed. He noted that people with genius qualities sometimes succeed best when they work least because they are thinking outside their discoveries and forming in their minds an idea of perfection. Procrastination, it turns out, is a common habit of creative thinkers and expert problem solvers. Consider the winners of the Science Talent Search, a competition known as the Super Bowl of Science for high school students in America. A research team led by psychologist Renée Subotnick interviewed elite artists more than a decade after their victories, when they were in their early 30s, to ask if they often procrastinated in their daily habits, creative tasks, as well as social life and health behaviors. Over 68% of those surveyed admitted they had procrastinated in at least two of the four areas. Procrastination was shown to be effective for creative work. Science stars used procrastination as a way to incubate ideas, preventing premature selection of an idea for a problem or solution, as one scientist explained. Often, when I'm procrastinating, it feels like there's a fire burning on my back, and I need time to complete it. Another said, in scientific work, ideas need time to mature, and procrastination is a way to curb the urge to respond to work hastily. After reflecting on interviews with thinkers and early problem solvers, Subotnick's team drew a curious conclusion. Paradoxically, those who are in the most urgent or most leisurely state are the ones who seem to procrastinate the most in creative fields. In U.S. history, perhaps only one speech is as famous as King's: Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. With only 272 words, Lincoln reframed the Civil War as a quest for freedom and equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. The official invitation to deliver the speech was sent to Lincoln more than 2 weeks earlier. The day before departing for Gettysburg, the president had only drafted half the speech. His secretary, John Nicolay, wrote that Lincoln probably followed his usual careful habit of thought in such matters to arrange his thoughts by mumbling them aloud, slowly writing, and altering them until they took perfect form. Lincoln finally didn't write the ending until the night before delivering the speech the next morning. He waited patiently because he wanted to develop the most compelling theme. In the early summer days before delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech, King asked 3 close advisors for suggestions on suitable content and tone for the speech. Later, King had an open dialogue about the speech with Clarence Jones, his lawyer and speechwriter. Then, King asked Jones and other activists to start writing a draft for the speech. In the following weeks, King resisted the temptation to settle on a theme or direction too early. He waited until 4 days before the march actually took place to proactively start writing the speech. The night before the march, he gathered a group of advisors to review the draft together. Jones recalled, King said, "This is a pivotal moment in our civil rights struggle. We should try our best to get the best ideas from the key figures of the movement." King organized this meeting by explaining that he wanted to review ideas and find the best approach. By delaying the task of writing and consolidating details before writing the speech, King gave Jones the benefit of the Zygarnik effect. In 1927, Russian psychologist Bluma Zygarnik demonstrated that people have better memories for unfinished tasks. Because once a task is completed, we stop thinking about it. But when it's interrupted and unfinished, it remains active in our minds. When Jones compared his first draft to the topic of that evening's discussion, something that worked its own way and echoed from deep within my subconscious. 4 months earlier, Jones had met Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a respected philanthropist who enthusiastically supported civil liberties and had funded King's release from a Birmingham jail. Rockefeller opened a bank account on a Saturday and gave Jones a briefcase containing $100,000. By bank regulation, Jones had to sign a promissory note, and Rockefeller would pay for it. Recalling the experience the night before King's speech, Jones realized that promissory notes might be a powerful metaphor. The next day, King used it in his speech. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note. But it is obvious today that the United States has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Finally, when King instructed Jones to prepare the final draft, it would include ideas that were his own. But that wasn't the only tangible benefit of procrastination, inspiration, and prayer. Half a century after he delivered his momentous speech, the first 4 words of the speech remain etched in our collective memory. "I have a dream." These words remain one of the most famous phrases in human rhetoric because they painted a vivid portrait of a better future. But I was surprised to learn that the dream idea was never written into the speech. It didn't appear in Jones's draft, and King didn't mention it anywhere in his script. During the speech, Mahalia Jackson, King's favorite gospel singer, shouted from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." He continued his speech, and she encouraged him again. Standing before a crowd of 250,000 people and millions watching on TV, King began to improvise, pushing his notes aside and guiding everyone towards an inspiring vision of the future. Before everyone, cameras and microphones, Clarence Jones described, "Martin took flight." Along with needing time to generate new ideas, procrastination also offers another benefit. It helps us unleash our improvisational abilities. When we prepare too thoroughly, we often get stuck to the outline we've created, closing off creative possibilities that could lead us to better new directions in the field we're speaking about. Years ago, Berkeley psychologist Donald McKinnon found that America's most creative architects tended to be more spontaneous and unconventional than their technically skilled but conformist colleagues. They were people who consistently rated themselves high in self-control and conscientiousness. In a study of pizza chains that I conducted with Francesca Gino and David Hoffman, the most profitable stores were managed by leaders who rated themselves as least efficient and timely. Similarly, when strategy researchers such as Nadkarni and Paul Herrick studied nearly 200 companies in India, the companies with the highest financial returns were those whose CEOs rated themselves as having the lowest efficiency and timeliness. In both cases, the most successful organizations were run by executives who admitted they often wasted time before sitting down to work and sometimes didn't achieve deadlines on time. Although these habits can hinder work progress, they help leaders demonstrate strategic flexibility and adaptability. In Indian companies, members of each company's top management team rated their CEOs on strategic flexibility. CEOs who planned carefully, acted early, and worked diligently were often seen as more rigid. Once they built a strategy, they would be stuck with it. CEOs who tended to procrastinate were often more flexible. They could change their strategies to seize new opportunities and protect the company from threats. When King stepped onto the podium for his speech, even as he approached the microphone, he was still revising it. Just before King spoke, political historian Drew Hansen wrote in the Dream asterisk. He broke through all limits and scribbled new things while he waited for his turn. And it looked as though King was still revising his speech until he stepped up to deliver it. In the Pulitzer Prize-winning book bearing the cross asterisk, historian David Garrow noted that King improvised like a jazz musician. King acted very naturally, starting with a small improvisation. One of the early parts of the written speech, called the promissory note and the Declaration of Independence, was a promise that all people would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Standing on the podium, King emphasized racial equality, a promise that all people, yes, black people as well as white people, must be guaranteed these unalienable rights. At the 11-minute mark of the speech, Mahalia Jackson prompted King to share his dream. It's unclear if he heard her, but it was just all of a sudden that I decided to change a bit, King recalled. He let his emotions guide him at that moment and expressed his dream. Before the speech was over, Hansen noted that King had added so much new material that his delivery time doubled. Great originality comes with reasonable procrastination, but it doesn't mean things go off script. They procrastinate strategically, innovating gradually by exploring and refining different possibilities. Although the dream memory was improvised, King had also tried speaking about it in various ways in previous speeches. He spoke about his dream almost a year earlier in November 1962 in Albany. And in the months that followed, he mentioned it frequently, from Birmingham to Detroit. Throughout the year he spoke of his dream, it is estimated he traveled over 275,000 miles and gave over 350 speeches. While King may have delayed writing the dream speech, he had a wealth of material to help him compose it instantly to increase its authenticity. King had converged all the elements of a successful speech, delivering them through his powerful oratory. Some parts were taken from other sermons, anecdotes, biblical passages, and lines from beloved poets. Hansen explained, King didn't write too much in the speech, but assembled it by rearranging and revising material he had used many times before. It gave King the flexibility to modify his speech as he delivered it. If King hadn't decided to discard the sections he had written before, who knows if his speech at the march would have been so memorable. After participating in startups with over 100 companies, Bill Gross, founder of Idealab, conducted an analysis to find out what drove success and what led to failure. The most important factor was not the originality of the idea, the team's ability and execution, the quality of the business model, or available funding. The number one important factor was timing, Gross revealed. Good timing accounted for 42% of the difference between success and failure. Research shows that in American culture, people strongly believe in the first-mover advantage. We always want to be pioneers, not followers. Scientists rush to make new discoveries before competitors. Inventors hurry to patent before rivals. Entrepreneurs want to launch products before their competitors. If you are the first to enter the world with a new product, service, or technology, you can be elevated to a new level, occupying key space and gaining a monopoly over customers. These things create barriers for competitors. Their efforts to innovate will be stifled by your inventions and first-mover advantage. And their growth will be hampered by the fact that it is difficult and costly to persuade customers to change. In a classic study, two marketing researchers, Peter Golder and Jerry Telles, compared the success of companies, both pioneers and followers. Pioneers were first movers, the first company to develop or sell a product. Followers were those who launched products later, waiting for pioneers to establish a market for the product before entering. Golder and Telles analyzed hundreds of brands across 30 different industries and found a surprising difference in failure rates: 47% for pioneers versus only 8% for followers. Pioneers were 6 times more likely to fail than followers. Even when pioneers survived, they only captured an average of 10% of the market compared to 28% for followers. Surprisingly, the drawbacks of pioneering are often greater than the positives. After careful review, studies show that pioneers can capture a larger market share but have fewer chances of survival and significantly lower profits. Marketing researcher Lisa Bolton concluded, while first movers may gain many advantages in certain niche industries, academic research on this is still very mixed, and overall does not support the first mover advantage. If you are easily tempted to rush into a new field, this knowledge will help you pause and carefully consider the ideal time to do so. But Bolton also realized something alarming. Even when people know that the evidence doesn't show a first mover advantage, they still believe in it. It's also easier to think that pioneers are successful. The failures have long been forgotten, so we still assume they are a rarity. The best way to break the myth of the first mover advantage is to ask people why it creates disadvantages for pioneers. In your experience, what are the 4 biggest limitations of a pioneer? Followers often copy business models or products and services, but often lack something. So, instead of catching up with current demand, they wait for the right moment until they are ready to introduce a new product. They often enter the market slowly because they are in the process of researching and developing revolutionary products, services, and technologies in that field. In the console gaming industry, an interactive computer that outputs video signals to display devices like TVs or computer monitors to show video games, Magnavox Odyssey was the pioneer in 1972, primarily producing crude sports games. But Nintendo, the follower, was different. This company licensed the Odyssey system and distributed it in Japan in 1975. Then it beat Magnavox in the next decade by creating the Nintendo Entertainment System with signature games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda *. Nintendo changed gaming with a user-friendly controller, complex characters, and interactive role-playing models. To be truly original, you are not required to be a pioneer, but you must certainly be different and do better than those who came before. When original individuals rush to be pioneers, they can easily overstep. That's the first disadvantage. Before the dot-com bubble burst, a young Goldman Sachs banker named Joseph Park was sitting in his apartment, frustrated when his attempts to access the internet for entertainment all failed. Why did he have to go to such lengths to Blockbuster to rent a movie? He should just be able to open a website, choose a movie, and have it delivered to his door. Despite growing revenue to $250 million, Cosmo.com, the company Park founded, went bankrupt. His biggest mistake was making a fragile promise of 1-hour delivery for almost everything and investing in building branches nationwide to support growth that never materialized. A study of 3,000 startups showed that about 3/4 of failed companies were due to immaturity, making investments too early when the market wasn't ready to accept them. If Park had proceeded slower, he might have realized that with existing technology, 1-hour delivery was impractical and unprofitable. However, the demand for online movies was huge. Netflix slowly emerged from its difficulties, and Cosmo could have competed in the mail-order rental business, and then later in online streaming. He later leveraged technological shifts that enabled Instacart to build a logistics system that made 1-hour grocery delivery feasible and profitable. When the market is more clearly defined and when followers enter, they can focus on providing the highest quality instead of wondering what to offer first. Do you want the second or third person to see what the first person did and then improve upon it? Malcolm Gladwell asked in an interview. When ideas become truly complex and the world also becomes complex, is it foolish to think that pioneers can do it all? Gladwell emphasized, most of the best things take a long time to figure out. Second, there's reason to believe that many people who choose to start later may be better suited for success. Risk seekers are often seen as leaders, and they tend to make impulsive decisions. Meanwhile, many businesses only want to take risks from the sidelines, waiting for the right opportunity and seeking to balance their risks before entering the market. In a study of software startups, strategy researchers Elizabeth Pontikes and William Barnett found that when entrepreneurs rushed to follow the crowd into booming markets, their startups were less likely to survive and grow. When entrepreneurs waited for the market to settle down, they had a higher success rate. No need to follow rules. Following trends is more likely to lead to market presence, funding, and ultimately, public acceptance. Third, coupled with ambition but less recklessness, followers who wait for stability can innovate based on competitors' technology to make their products better. When you are the first to bring a new product to market, you bear all the mistakes yourself. Meanwhile, followers who wait for stability can watch and learn from your mistakes. Being a pioneer is a tactic, not a goal, Peter Thiel wrote in *0 to 1*. Being first will not do you any good if someone comes along and is ready to unseat you. Fourth, while pioneers tend to get stuck with what already exists, followers can observe market changes and shifts in consumer preferences and then adapt accordingly. A study of the U.S. automobile industry, spanning nearly a century, showed that pioneers had lower survival rates because they struggled to establish legitimacy, develop new market norms, and then became obsolete as consumer demand became clearer. The value of waiting for the market to be ready before entering has its own merits for followers. When Warby Parker launched, e-commerce companies had already flourished for over a decade, and although other companies had tried to sell glasses online without much success, it couldn't be done before, Neil Blumenthal told me. We had to wait for Amazon, Zappos, and Blue Nile to make customers comfortable buying products they fundamentally wouldn't want to buy online. This holds true even in fields other than business, where key individuals, ideas, and movements failed because they were ahead of their time. At the CIA in the early 1990s, when Carmen Medina first initiated the idea of sharing digital information online for faster access, the CIA was not ready to consider the idea. When electronic communication became safer and more familiar, people became more receptive to the ideas. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the mistaken assessment of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, people became even more aware of the value of lacking communication between security agencies, with catastrophic consequences. Timing is everything, Medina's colleague, Susan Benjamin, emphasized. By the time we spoke up, things became so clear that even the most conservative people admitted we had done something different, and the time was right for it. It was hard for anyone with a brain not to listen to her and agree that it was a path to take. In the 1840s, when Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis pointed out that medical students washing their hands thoroughly during childbirth significantly reduced mortality rates, he was scorned by his colleagues and ended his life in a mental hospital. It took 2 decades for his idea to gain scientific legitimacy when Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch laid the theoretical groundwork for germ theory. Physicist Max Planck once remarked, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." I don't mean to imply that being a pioneer is entirely unwise. If all of us waited for others to act first, no initial originality would be created. Someone has to be the pioneer, and sometimes they pay the price for it. The pioneer's advantage is that they tend to dominate in areas related to patenting technology, or when there's a strong enough network effect, where products or services become more valuable with a large number of users, as with phones or social media. But in most cases, your odds of success are not high if you are a pioneer. And when the market is uncertain, unclear, or underdeveloped, being a pioneer comes with many disadvantages. The key lesson here is that if you have an original idea, it would be a mistake to rush its development with the sole purpose of beating competitors to the finish line. Just as procrastination can help us be flexible in a task, delaying entry into the market can open opportunities for us to learn and adapt, reducing the risks of originality. But what happens when we extend procrastination beyond the task's timeline and the product's life cycle? Throughout a person's life, what is the risk of waiting too long to act? The life cycle of creativity, young geniuses and seasoned masters. It's generally believed that originality stems from the fountain of youth. According to renowned venture capitalist Vinod Khosla, people under 35 are the ones who create change. People over 45 are basically dead in terms of ideas. After first publishing his revolutionary papers on relativity in his mid-20s, Albert Einstein made a similar remark. A person who has not made his great contribution to science before the age of 30 will never do so. It's tragic. Innovators often lose their originality over time. After Einstein made his paradigm-shifting discoveries in physics on relativity, Outlined in his two papers, he opposed quantum mechanics, which later became a major revolution in physics. To punish me for my contempt for authority, fate has given me authority myself, Einstein regretted. This decline is inevitable. However, when companies open their suggestion boxes, they find that older employees tend to submit more ideas, and their ideas are of higher quality than their younger colleagues, with the most valuable proposals coming from employees over 55. In the tech industry, startups that raise significant capital have founders whose average age is 38. In the arts and sciences, Chicago economist David Galenson says, "While we are quick to remember young geniuses who peak early, there are also many seasoned masters who peak later." In medicine, for every James Watson, who discovered the double helix structure of DNA at 25, there is a Roger Sperry, who recognized the specialization between the left and right brain hemispheres at 49. In cinema, for every Orson Welles, who created the cinematic masterpiece Citizen Kane *, his first film at 25, there is an Alfred Hitchcock, who made his three most famous films over 3 decades of his career at ages 59 Vertigo, 60 North by Northwest, and 61 Psycho. In poetry, for every E. Cummings, who wrote his first influential poem at 22 and more than half of his greatest works before turning 40, there is a Robert Frost, who wrote 92% of his most reprinted poems after the age of 40. What explains these completely different cycles of creativity? Why do some people peak early, while others' brilliant periods come later? The timing of our peaks of originality and how long they last depends on our way of thinking. When Galenson studied creators, he discovered 2 completely different styles of innovation: conceptual and experimental. Conceptual creators typically form a big idea and then arrange to execute it. Experimental creators solve problems through trial and error, learning and developing as they go. They address a specific problem, but they don't have a specific solution in mind from the start. Instead of planning ahead, they gradually solve the problem as they work. Writer E.M. Forster explained, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" According to Galenson, conceptual creators are sprinters and experimental creators are marathon runners. When he studied Nobel laureate economists, on average, conceptual creators had their most influential works at age 43, while experimental creators achieved theirs at age 61. When he analyzed the reprinted poems of famous poets, conceptual creators authored their best poems at age 28 compared to experimental creators at age 39. And in an independent study of every Nobel laureate physicist among young geniuses under 30, exactly half of them were conceptual creators with groundbreaking works. Among seasoned masters aged 45 and older, 92% of them created experimental works. The fundamental differences between conceptual and experimental creators explain why some peak early while others achieve brilliance later. Conceptual creations can be executed quickly because they don't require years of systematic inquiry. When Watson and Crick discovered the double helix structure of DNA, they didn't have to wait to accumulate data. They built a theoretical 3-dimensional model and tested X-ray images provided by Rosalind Franklin. Furthermore, conceptual breakthroughs tend to happen early because discovering striking originality, when we approach a problem with a fresh perspective, is truly easiest. Conceptual creators often make their most significant contributions to a field of science soon after they enter it. Galenson found that for this reason, conceptual creators become less strikingly original once they become entrenched in conventional ways of approaching problems. As Galenson explained, the inability of aging conceptual creators to look back at their youthful brilliance does not reflect a decline in the wondrous supply of creative art. Instead, it is caused by the effects of accumulated experience. The true enemy of conceptual creators is the formation of fixed habits of thought. Conceptual creators can become imprisoned by their initial significant achievements. As a conceptual creator, this was Einstein's problem. When he developed his famous theory of relativity, he didn't conduct scientific experiments, but thought about thought experiments. He imagined himself chasing a beam of light. His major contribution to science was ideas and theories that explained others' experimental results. Once Einstein's principles of relativity were accepted, he struggled to adapt to the shift from the principles required by quantum physics. In poetry, Galenson pointed out that E. E. Cummings faced a similar obstacle. After imagining his own rules for language, syntax, and punctuation in his 20s, he reached his 50s, and a critic remarked that Cummings remained an experimenter on his only experiment. The interesting thing about Cummings is that he always talked about evolution, and it was always the same. Later, when Cummings was 65, another remark stated that Cummings was a bold, original poet, but his poetry collections were entirely alike. As psychologist Abraham Maslow observed, if you only have a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. However, while experimental creativity may require years or decades to accumulate the necessary knowledge and skills, it becomes a more solid foundation for originality. Roger Sperry spent years conducting experiments with cats and split-brain patients to determine how brain hemispheres worked. Robert Frost didn't write any of his most reprinted poems in his 20s, and only 8% were written in his 30s. His brilliant period finally bloomed in his 40s and again in his 60s. Step by step, poet Robert Lowell noted, Frost observed places and people until his best poems achieved the richness of great novels. Like an explorer, Frost gathered all data by venturing into the world, carefully listening to real conversations. I would never use a word or phrase that I hadn't heard in a speech, Frost admitted. Each poem is an experiment in mixing different elements. Not surprising to writers and not too surprising to readers. He enjoyed sharing, "When I start writing a poem, I know nothing. I don't want to write a poem that I can say is headed for a happy ending. You get happy discoveries before the end." Conceptual creators tend to generate original ideas initially but risk copying each other. Experimental approaches take longer but prove to be more novel. Instead of copying existing ideas, experiments allow us to continue discovering new ones. One scholar noted that Mark Twain published Asterisk Adventures of Huckleberry Finn Asterisk at 49, using trial and error, and found his plot easily changeable during execution, so he wrote the story without any decisions or plans in mind. Twain himself commented that, when a short story grows into a long one, the original purpose or main idea may be abandoned and replaced by a different, new perspective. To maintain originality as we get older and accumulate experience, the best successful bet is to adopt an experimental approach. We can sketch out a few plans for what we want to create, start experimenting with different types of ideas and exploratory solutions. Finally, with enough patience, we can hit on something new and useful. Experimental approaches also helped Leonardo da Vinci a lot. He was 46 when he completed The Last Supper, and in his 50s when he began painting the Mona Lisa asterisk. Only by painting did he truly understand and clarify his vision, one scholar wrote, and another suggested that Leonardo worked like a sculptor with clay, never accepting any form as final, always seeking creativity, even at the risk of obscuring his original intention. Martin Luther King Jr. was also an experimental creator. Although he was only 34 when he delivered the Dream speech, it was his 20th year in public speaking about human rights. At 15, he delivered original speeches on human rights at a statewide final. He spent years in intermittent experiments with words that could clearly articulate his views. In his thousands of speeches, he continually practiced different tones and passages. Drawing experience from a former teacher, he achieved originality, as scholar Carroll and Blake described, by putting old problems in new combinations and new things in old combinations. Good things come to those who wait, and for experimental philosophers, it's never too late to be original. After architect Frank Lloyd Wright received the contract for Fallingwater, his most famous architectural work, he procrastinated for almost a year on fragmented sketches before completing the design at 68. Raymond Davis shared that the Nobel Prize in Physics he received was for research he began at 51 and finished at 80. The more experiments you conduct, the less bound you become by your past views. You learn from what you discover in your audiences, paintings, or factual data. Instead of sinking into the quagmire of imagination, by looking directly at the world, you improve your peripheral vision. Sprinting is a good strategy for a young genius, but to become a seasoned master, patience and experimentation is needed for a marathon. Both paths lead to creativity. However, for those who lack deep insight, slow and steady experimentation can illuminate the path to originality, even if it takes longer. Of course, not all 65-year-olds who haven't achieved anything are undiscovered experimental creators, author Daniel Pink reflects. But it can strengthen our resolve to keep creating, never discouraged, to achieve success like the persistent turtle in the story of the tortoise and the hare. So we have finished part 1, Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World. Perhaps what you just heard isn't new, but the way you look at it may have changed a bit. Sometimes the world doesn't change because of big things, but because one person starts to think differently. Slow down a bit, ask more questions, and stop following familiar paths. Thinking differently won't make you stand out immediately, but it helps you stop being carried away by things that aren't inherently yours. And just that alone, you've started to move. If there's one thing you can take away from this section, it's perhaps not an answer, but a new perspective for you to rethink in your own way.